The lamp had burned down to a stub. Rain moved slow against the window of the little farmhouse at Spaldwick, and inside, a young woman sat up in her bed and could not understand why the room would not stay still. Her name was Annie Holmes. She was 29. On the table beside her lay a small paper packet, folded twice, and a letter in a hand she knew as well as her own. The letter was signed by her cousin Walter. It told her to take the powder in a little water, and to tell no one, and to trust him. She had trusted him. The clock on the shelf struck 2. Somewhere below, a dog began to whine at the kitchen door and would not be quieted, and Annie Holmes reached for the cup she should never have drunk. The quiet fields of Spaldwick. Good evening, and welcome. Welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, wherever you are, and the world has grown small around you. I do not know where you are listening from tonight. Perhaps a bedroom in a city where the traffic never fully rests. Perhaps a small room in a house on a country lane, with the wind moving in the hedge outside. Perhaps a long drive through the dark, with the road unspooling ahead of you, and the dashboard the only light. Wherever you are, and whatever the hour on your side of the night, I am glad you are here. If you find the sound of this room a comfort, and if you would like to hear more of these old, quiet stories, it would help us more than you know if you would follow along with the channel and give this recording a small mark of approval before you drift. It is a little thing on your side. On ours, it is the reason the candle stays lit. Now let us go back, not far, as centuries go, only to the flat green country of Huntingdonshire in the last long years of the old Queen, and to a village called Spaldwick that sat then and sits now on the low ground between Kimbolton and the market town of Huntingdon. If you have never stood in that country, it is worth a moment to see it in the mind before we meet the people who lived in it. This is not the England of hills and moors. There are no crags here, and no wild coasts. The land lies flat, or nearly so, in long, shallow fields divided by hawthorn hedges that have been laid and cut by the same hands for 4 or 5 generations. In late autumn, the ploughed earth is the colour of old iron. In summer, the wheat runs pale gold to the horizon, and the horizon is only a line of low elms and the square tower of a parish church. The roads in 1860 and 1870 were still mostly of packed chalk and flint, rutted deep by cartwheels in the wet months, and white with dust in the dry ones. A man walking from Spaldwick to Kimbolton in the winter of that century came home with his boots the colour of the road, and his trouser legs stiff to the knee. Into this country, in the year 1869, Walter Horsford was born. His father was a farmer of the middling sort, holding land as a tenant rather than an owner, working the same fields his own father had worked before him. His mother came from a family of the same kind, a few miles down the lane, in a hamlet called Stow Longer. The two names, Spaldwick and Stow, will move through this whole story like the two ends of a length of rope. They are only 3 miles apart on the map. On foot, across the fields, they are closer than that. A strong walker could cross from one to the other in an hour, less if the ground was hard. Cousins visited on Sundays, sisters married brothers of neighbours. The two villages shared a market, a doctor, and a set of surnames that repeated down the parish registers until it was sometimes hard to tell one household from another without opening the book. Walter was not the eldest child, and he was not the youngest. He was a middle son in a house of several, with an older brother already learning the work of the land by the time Walter was old enough to be taken out to the field on his father's shoulders. The parish register at Spaldwick spells the family name 2 ways in different years, and I have never worked out which spelling the Horsfords themselves preferred, if they thought about it at all. Most farming families of that time and that country did not fuss over a letter here or there. A name was what the vicar wrote down, and what the neighbours called you at market, and those two things did not always match. The house he was raised in stood a little way outside the village proper, along a lane that ran off toward the fields. It was a working farmhouse, not a fine one. The walls were of soft local brick, the roof was of pantile, and the yard behind the kitchen door held a pump, a wash-house, a long low barn for the cattle in winter, and a smaller shed where the pig lived. A privy stood at the end of the garden, well away from the well. That was the shape of every farm of that size in the county. You could have walked into any of them and known where the churn would be, and where the sacks of feed were kept, and which door led down to the dairy. The dairy was, in a real sense, the centre of the house. In a Huntingdonshire farmhouse of that kind, in that decade, butter and cheese were made on the flagged floor of a north-facing room with a slate slab down one side and a wooden churn set beside it. The room was kept as cold as the family could keep it. Even in July, it had the smell of stone and milk and the faint sharpness of scalded metal. Walter's mother would have been in that room for hours of every week, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair tied back under a linen cap, and Walter, as a small boy, would have been under her feet, or set on the step outside the door with a piece of bread and dripping to keep him quiet. Bread and dripping. It is a small thing to mention, and it is easy to pass over, but a child in that house in 1874 ate what the season and the pig gave. In the morning, thick slices from a loaf baked at the kitchen range, spread with the pale fat rendered from a Sunday joint and sprinkled with salt. At midday, if the men were in from the field, a stew of neck of mutton with onions and the last of the winter carrots, or a suet pudding boiled in a cloth with a scrap of bacon and a handful of dried peas. At night, bread again, cheese from the dairy, an apple from the store loft above the barn where the fruit lay in single layers on straw, from Michaelmas to Candlemas. Tea was drunk strong, without milk in the poorer weeks and with plenty of it in the good ones. Meat, in a household of that class, appeared oftener than in a labourer's cottage, but it was never wasted. A hen that stopped laying went into the pot. The trotters and the ears of the pig were as much a part of the winter as its hams. Money was not spoken of at the table, but it was in the air of the room all the same. A farmer of Walter's father's kind, holding perhaps 150 acres, on a written lease from a landlord in Huntingdon or in London, paid his rent twice a year at Lady Day and Michaelmas, in coin counted out on a table in the agent's office. The sum was not small. In the 1870s, on ground of that quality, a rent of 30 shillings the acre was common, and some fields were dearer. That meant a bill of £200 or more each year before a seed was bought or a horse shod. A hired man on the same farm earned 12 shillings a week and his cottage, and thought himself in steady work. A dairymaid earned less. A boy of Walter's age, once he was strong enough, could be sent out at harvest for 6pence a day and his food. These figures were not abstract. They were the arithmetic of the kitchen. A bad harvest, or a beast lost in calving, or a barn caught by fire in a dry August, could shift a household from comfort to worry in a single season, and every child in a farmhouse of that time knew it before they knew their letters. Walter learned his letters at the village school. There had been a school of some kind at Spaldwick for many years, run out of a room adjoining the church, but by the time Walter was old enough to attend, the parish had built a proper little schoolhouse, one room with a high roof, a stove at one end, and long benches down either side of a plain deal table. A schoolmistress from outside the parish taught the younger children, and an assistant kept order among the older ones. The lessons were reading, writing on a slate, some arithmetic, and the catechism. In the winter months, when the ground was too hard to plough, the room was full. In the summer, when the fields wanted every hand, the benches thinned out, and the mistress said nothing about it. That was the understanding. He was, by every account that survives, a quiet child, not sullen, and not shy in any way that troubled his mother, but self-contained in the way that some children are from the beginning. He did what he was told. He worked when he was set to work. He did not make friends easily, but he did not quarrel either. In a large farming family, that kind of child is often overlooked in favour of the noisier ones, and it seems that Walter was overlooked in exactly that way. His older brother was said to be strong and open, well liked at the market and quick with the horses. A younger sister was said to sing. Walter neither drew notice nor gave trouble, and so no one thought very much about him at all. You have to hold that steadily in the mind, because it will matter later. A child who is neither loved out loud nor complained of out loud grows up with a quietness inside him that no one has bothered to look into. And in the rural England of that decade, no one would have thought it worth looking into. A boy was raised to be useful, to sit upright in the pew on a Sunday, and to speak civilly to the vicar. What he thought at night, in the dark of the small room he shared with his brother, was not the business of the house. The chapel and the church between them shaped the week. Spaldwick's parish church was, and is, the Church of St. James, a plain and ancient building of pale stone, with a low tower and a broad churchyard full of leaning slates. There was also a chapel of the Wesleyan sort, plainer still, that some of the families in the village attended in preference. The Horsfords, in Walter's early years, sat in the parish church on a Sunday morning, and again in the evening, in the pew that was known to be theirs by long habit rather than by any formal rite. He would have worn on those days a jacket of dark cloth, a linen shirt with a stiff collar that his mother starched on the Saturday, boots polished with a black grease made of soot and mutton fat, and a small cap that he took off at the church door and did not put back on until he was 2 paces down the path. Every child in that pew wore the same, or its equal. It was the uniform of respectability in a country parish, and its price was watched carefully. A pair of boots cost 7 shillings and had to last a growing boy a year. Beyond the church, the year moved by the calendar of the fields. There was ploughing in autumn, and drilling in the early spring, and haymaking in June, and harvest in August, and the great slow work of threshing, and the cattle brought in through the wet months of the year's end. Walter, by the time he was 10, was out with his father and the men for parts of all of it. He learned to lead a horse by the bridle, and to keep his hand still on the plough handle. He learned to make a stook of wheat that would stand up to a wet wind. He learned to kill a rat cleanly in the barn with a stick. Country boys of that age learned these things because there was no one to do them if they did not. He also learned, in a way that will matter, the small brown bottles and cardboard boxes that stood on a shelf in the harness room. A working farm in the 1870s and 1880s was not innocent of poison. Rats ate the seed corn and killed the young chickens, and rats were dealt with by any means to hand. Foxes were dealt with by the shotgun and the terrier, but the smaller vermin, the mice in the granary and the sparrows in the eaves and the rats in the straw, were dealt with by powders bought at the ironmonger's shop in Kimbleton or the chemist's in Huntingdon, in small waxed packets marked with the black cross of the age. Arsenic was on that shelf. So, in some houses, was strychnine, sold openly for the destruction of dogs suspected of worrying sheep, or of a fox that had taken to the hen-house. A farmer signed a book at the chemist's counter, gave his name and his purpose, and carried the packet home in his coat pocket. No one thought it strange. It was as ordinary as buying nails. The record does not say when Walter first was sent, on his own, into a shop of that kind on his father's errand. It does not say when he first read the small printed warnings on the packets, or when he first understood that the powder inside would kill a full-grown ewe within the hour if she got at it in the barn. But we can say, without straining, that he grew up in a house where those packets were part of the furniture of work, and where the arithmetic of dose and effect was spoken of at the kitchen table in the same tone as the price of hay. That knowledge would sit in him quietly for years, the way most knowledge does in a farming child, until the day came when he had a use for it. For now, though, he was only a boy in a pew, a boy on a plough, a boy at a slate in the schoolroom in the winter, and out among the sheaves in the summer. The village around him was small and settled, and, in its own eyes, blameless. The lanes were white with chalk in dry weather, and heavy with mud in wet. The rooks quarrelled in the elms above the churchyard. The bell of St. James rang for morning service and for evening service, and, once or twice a year, for a wedding or a burial, and the sound of it carried a long way across the flat ground toward the neighbouring parishes. One of those neighbouring parishes was Stow Longer, and in Stow Longer, in a farmhouse of the same modest sort as his own, there lived a girl a few years younger than Walter, a cousin on his mother's side, whose name was Annie Holmes. She had brown hair and a quiet manner and a habit of looking at the ground when she was spoken to by anyone she did not know well. She sat in the pew at Stow with her own mother and father, and she came over the fields to Spaldwick on many Sundays through the year, because the two families were close enough in blood and in habit to keep the paths between their kitchens well worn. Walter, at 10 and 11 and 12, would have seen her often, He would have carried her a plate at the harvest supper, and passed her a hymn book at the church door, and stood aside for her at the stile between the two parishes with the small, grave courtesy that a country boy of that age was taught to show to a cousin. Neither of them, on those Sundays, would have thought anything of it at all. They were only children in the same wide family, in the same flat country, under the same low grey sky. The lane between Spaldwick and Stow was only a lane. The years ahead of them were only years, and the small brown packets on the shelf in the harness room were only, for now, a matter of rats. A family of cousins. Let me carry the story forward into Chapter 2, keeping the companion voice light at the seams and holding the language plain. Before we go into the second of the two farmhouses, come with me for a moment out onto the lane between them. It is easier to see the shape of this whole story if you stand in the middle of it first. The road from Spaldwick to Stow Longer runs east and a little south, past a stand of elms and a low stone bridge over a stream that has no name on any map I have found. 3 miles by the road, less by the fields. In the 1870s and 1880s, in wet weather, a woman in long skirts would take the road and lift her hem out of the ruts. In dry weather, she would cut across the wheat by the paths the labourers used, and save herself 20 minutes and a pair of stockings. That lane and those paths are the ground on which our second family lived. The Holmes household at Stow Longer held a farm of much the same kind as the Horsfords at Spaldwick, not larger, not richer. The lease was for something under 200 acres of mixed ground, part arable and part pasture, with a small orchard behind the house and a paddock for the pony that pulled the trap into Kimbleton on market days. The father of that house, Annie's father, was a tenant like Walter's father, and had grown up in the same parish as Walter's mother, and had known her since they were children in the same schoolroom. That is the piece to hold on to. Annie's father and Walter's mother were brother and sister. It was not distant kinship. It was blood in the plain sense, the sense that in a country parish still meant a great deal, and that in a courtroom, 20 years later, would mean rather more than either family had bargained for. So when Walter Horsford, at 10 or 11 years old, sat down at the table in the Holmes kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, he was sitting in his uncle's house, and when Annie Holmes, at 7 or 8, was lifted onto a chair in the Horsford dairy to watch her aunt turn a churn, she was in her aunt's house. Neither child had to be told any of this. In the parishes of Huntingdonshire in that decade, a child of 6 knew every cousin by name and by degree, and could tell you which was a first cousin and which was a second, and which was only what the older women called a connection. The parish register was recited at the kitchen table on winter evenings in the same tone as a schoolmistress reciting the Kings of England. That, too, was a kind of education. The Holmes farmhouse itself was older than the Horsfords, and lower, and set back further from the road. Its walls were of the same soft brick, weathered to a dark rose, and the roof was of the same red pantile, but the windows were narrower and the ceilings inside were lower, so that a grown man had to duck a little going through the doorway from the kitchen into the parlour. The kitchen was the room the family lived in. The parlour was for the vicar and for burials. That division of the house was the ordinary one across the county in that decade, and a child growing up in it learned early which room to shout in and which room to walk softly across, in stockinged feet, without touching the furniture. You can see the room, I think, without much help from me. A long deal table scrubbed pale by many years of a stiff brush and a bar of yellow soap. A settle along one wall, dark with the polish of shoulders. A range at the far end, black and warm, with a kettle on the hob and a line of drying cloths above it. On the mantel, 2 brass candlesticks and a china figure of a shepherdess that had been a wedding gift to Annie's grandmother, and a Bible in a leather binding that opened by itself to the Psalms. On the floor, flags of local stone, worn hollow in front of the range where 4 generations of women had stood to stir a pot. At the window, a plain white curtain, taken down every Monday to be washed. This was the room where Annie was raised. It smelt, as farmhouse kitchens of that time smelt, of wood smoke and boiled onions and the faint sourness of a milk pail set to drain. Annie was not an only child. She had, if the parish register is read carefully, 2 older brothers and a younger sister. and at least one infant who did not live long enough to appear in any register at all. That last is a gap in the record. Country families of that time buried very young children with a plain wooden cross and a line in the vicar's book, and sometimes not even that, and the memory of the loss stayed only in the mother's face and in a name that the family never used again for a later child. Whether the Holmes household carried such a loss in Annie's early years is not something I can tell you with any certainty. It is only that the arithmetic of the surviving children and the years between them makes it likely. The two older brothers went out to the fields with their father before Annie was old enough to notice. The younger sister was too small to be a companion for a long time. So Annie, in the middle, grew up as a girl who was often the only child in the kitchen with her mother, and who was set early to the work of a farmhouse daughter, feeding the poultry in the yard, gathering eggs from the corners of the barn where the hens hid them, learning to pluck a bird cleanly, learning to skim the cream from a pan, and to press butter into a wooden mould with a print of a thistle on its face. The thistle mould was the Holmes mark at market. Every farmhouse dairy had one. A cheesemonger in Kimbolton knew whose butter he was buying by the print on the top of the pat. She went to the parish school at Stow Longer, in a room even plainer than the Spaldwick one, and she went to it more steadily than the boys of her family did, because a girl was less use in the field at harvest than a boy. She learned to read from the same primer as her cousins across the lane. She learned to write a plain, upright hand that she would keep for the rest of her life. She learned the catechism from a curate who came out once a week from Kimbolton on a bay cob, and she learned to sew from her mother, in the hour after tea, sitting on the settle with a rushlight held over the work by an iron stand that clamped to the arm of the chair. The two households met, as I have said, on Sundays and at every fair and market and harvest supper that the year turned round. They met in the church at Spaldwick more often than in the church at Stow, because St. James was the larger building and held the family christenings and weddings by long custom. The pew the Horsfords sat in was near the front, on the south side. The Holmes family, on the Sundays they came over the fields, sat in the pew directly behind. That is not a small detail. In an English parish church of the last century, where you sat was who you were, and who sat behind you was, in a real sense, your kin. Every Sunday of Walter's boyhood, when he turned his head to pass a hymn book, he passed it to Annie or to one of her brothers. Every Sunday of Annie's girlhood, when the sermon grew long, the back of Walter's head was the thing directly in front of her eyes. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because the whole of what comes later is folded inside it. Two children, kin by blood, seated in two pews one behind the other, week after week, year after year, from the time they were old enough to be brought into the church until the time they were old enough to walk out of it and stand on the path together while the older people talked. There is no great scene in this. There is no glance across a room, no snatched hand at a stile. There is only the slow, ordinary building of a familiarity that no one in either family thought worth remarking on, because it was the familiarity of cousins, and cousins were a category the parish believed it understood. The courtesies between them were the courtesies of the parish, and they were exact. Walter, at 12 or 13, stood aside for Annie at the church door. Annie, at 10 or 11, curtsied a fraction of an inch to Walter's mother when she came into the Holmes kitchen with a covered basket on her arm. At the harvest supper in either farmyard, the boys of the family carried a plate first to the oldest woman in the room, then to the vicar if he had come, then to the aunts, and only then to the girls their own age. A boy who forgot the order was corrected sharply by his mother, without a word being spoken, only a look across the trestle. Walter, by every account we have, never forgot the order. He was a boy who watched and remembered and did what was correct. Annie, by every account we have, was a girl who did not need correcting either. That is the ground the two of them grew up on. It looks in the record like nothing at all, and it was, at the time, nothing at all. And that is precisely the point. Money at the Holmes table was much the same as money at the Horsford table, and it was managed in much the same way. The rent went twice a year to the agent in Huntingdon. The wages of a hired man and a dairymaid went weekly, in silver, out of a small tin box kept in a drawer of the parlour dresser. The market takings came back into the same box in a cloth bag and were counted out on a Sunday evening on the parlour table by Annie's father, with the doors shut and the children sent into the kitchen. £140 a year in rent, £35 a year in wages, perhaps £60 or £70 in the ordinary expenses of the house, from the chandler's bill to the shoeing of the horses. What was left, in a good year, was the margin the family lived on, and it was never large. In a poor year there was no margin at all, and the tin box grew light, and the mother of the house began to look tired around the eyes, and to send the younger children out of the kitchen when the account book was open. Both households carried, in Annie's growing years, the same small worries: a barn roof needing thatch, a cow that would not hold to the bull, a boy who wanted to be a clerk instead of a farmer and would have to be argued with. Neither carried, in that decade, any worry larger than that. There was no scandal in either name. There was no debt of the kind that ran through a village on the tongues of women at the pump. The Horsfords and the Holmeses were, in the plain phrase of the parish, respectable people, and the respect was earned by the doing of respectable things, year in and year out. A christening, a confirmation, a burial, a rent day, a harvest, a Christmas, a Lady Day, and all of it done in the sight of the two churches and the one chemist and the one doctor, who between them made up the visible authority of the district. There was, of course, more than one Holmes and more than one Horsford in the wider connection, and it is worth naming that briefly, so that later, when a witness in a courtroom uses a first name only, you will not lose the thread. Annie's own name in full was Annie Holmes, and that is the name that will carry the rest of this story. Her father was Robert. Her mother was Rebecca, born a Horsford, sister to Walter's father. There were also cousins on the further side of both families, in the parishes of Kimbolton and Catworth and Great Staunton, who came into the two farmhouses on high days and left in an hour or two, and who need not detain us here. The thing to hold is only that in the 15 miles between those villages, the same 6 or 7 surnames repeated over and over, and that Horsford and Holmes were 2 of them, and that they were bound together by more than one marriage in more than one generation. That kind of tight weaving is not, in itself, either a virtue or a fault. In a countryside where a girl might in her whole life travel no further than the market town and back, kinship was the shape of the world. It gave you a bed on a long journey. It gave you a witness for your wedding and a bearer for your coffin. It gave you a person, in a bad year, to whom you could go for the loan of 10 shillings without a note being written and without your name being spoken in the village afterward. And it gave you, if the wind blew wrong, a person to whom you could not say no when you should have. All of these were carried inside the phrase, our own people, and Walter Horsford and Annie Holmes, from the time they could speak, understood themselves to be, in that sense, each other's own. The years turned. Walter left the schoolroom at Spaldwick before he was 14 and went out full-time onto his father's ground and grew tall for his age and quiet in the way I described before, and began to take on the business of the farm as if he had been born already knowing it. Annie stayed in the schoolroom a little longer, because a girl could be spared better, and then came home to the dairy and to the settle by the range, and grew into a woman with brown hair pinned back beneath a white cap, and the same habit of looking at the ground when a stranger spoke to her. Between them, across the lane and the fields, the ordinary traffic of 2 neighbouring farmhouses went on. A basket of butter carried over, a hymn book returned, a message about the shared use of a bull, a word at the church door about an aunt taken ill in Kimbolton. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, in a year that no register records because there is no register that records such a thing, the ordinary traffic of cousins began to change, without ceremony and without announcement, into something else. Not yet a courtship, in the sense that either family would have used the word. Not yet a matter for the parish to see, only a small alteration in how often Walter's route home from Kimbolton took him past the Holmes gate, and how often Annie's errands to the shop at Spaldwick fell on a Wednesday afternoon, when Walter's own work was done. Neither of them would have called it anything at all. Neither of the mothers, watching from a kitchen window, would have called it anything either, though one of them may have set down the cloth she was folding and stood a moment longer at the glass than she needed to. The lane between Spaldwick and Stow was only a lane. The years ahead of them were still only years. But the paths across the fields were beginning to be walked, on both sides, by two people who had run out of reasons to pretend they were walking them for anyone else. Chapter 2 is complete at approximately 2,500 words, ending on a soft turn toward the coming courtship. The courtship that was not spoken of. Come with me a few years further along the same lane. That is the easiest way to move in a story like this one. A few paces at a time, over ground you have already stood on. Nothing dramatic has changed in either farmhouse. The pantile roofs are the same. The bull at the Holmes place is now the son of the bull that was there when we last looked. Walter Horsford is 19, and then 20, and then 22. Annie Holmes is a year younger at every count. And the paths between Spaldwick and Stow Longer are being walked, on both sides, more often than the errands strictly require. We are somewhere between 1889 and 1892 now. The exact month a private attachment begins is almost never written down, and it is not written down here. The parish register at Stow keeps only births, marriages and burials. The day book at the Kimbolton chemist keeps only what was sold, and to whom, and for what stated purpose. Nothing between two young cousins on a farm track in the last week of harvest is anyone's business to record. What we have instead is a pattern, and the pattern begins to show, if you set the sources side by side, from about the time Walter turned 20. The pattern is this. Walter's cart, on its way home from market in Kimbolton, began to take the longer road that ran by the Holmes gate, rather than the shorter road that cut through Barham. It added 20 minutes to his journey. His father, who was not a fool, said nothing about it at the supper table, though he would have known the road his son had taken from the state of the wheels when the cart was pushed into the shed. In the same season, Annie's Wednesday errands to the shop at Spaldwick, for a paper of pins, for a card of buttons, for a £1/4 of tea that could just as easily have been bought at Stow, began to fall, without fail, on the afternoons when Walter was known to be finished with his own work by 4. They met on those afternoons at the stile between the two parishes. That stile, 3 worn oak steps and a handrail rubbed to a shine by 50 years of use, is the one physical object in this chapter that I would ask you to hold in mind. Every scene of their courtship, so far as the courtship had scenes at all, happened within sight of it. It stood at the far edge of the Horsford pasture, where the hedge broke for a footpath, and it led onto a strip of unploughed headland along the edge of a wheat field belonging to a farmer named Rands, who had no daughter of his own to walk that way, and did not much care who did. The first meetings were nothing at all, a greeting, a remark about the weather, or about an aunt in Kimbolton whose cough would not go, a hymn book to be returned. Walter would set his hand on the top of the stile and lean against it, and Annie would stand on the wheatfield side with her basket on her arm, and the whole exchange would last 5 minutes and end with each of them walking on. Anyone coming up the path from either direction would have seen only 2 cousins, exactly what they were, pausing at a stile the way cousins in that country had paused at stiles for as long as there had been stiles. But you cannot meet a person at the same stile every Wednesday afternoon for a year and a half and go on saying nothing to them. Whatever was said between Walter Horsford and Annie Holmes on that headland in the 1890s, no one wrote it down, and neither of them, so far as the record shows, ever repeated it to another living person. When the Assize Court, years later, asked witnesses what they knew of the attachment between the 2 cousins, the witnesses answered with what they had seen from a distance. No one had heard a word of it from either mouth. That silence, of 2 people talking across a stile in an empty field for the better part of a year and telling nobody, is one of the things it is easy to miss in the record, and one of the most important things in it. Because it means the attachment was hidden by choice, not by chance, not by shyness, not by the accident of a rural place where no one much noticed anyone. It was hidden because Walter, at 22, already understood that his mother's brother's daughter was not a woman he could bring, plainly, to his own parents' kitchen and say he meant to marry. The 2 families would not have forbidden the match outright. First cousin marriages were lawful in England then, and were made every year in the surrounding parishes without any raised voice. But this particular one, between 2 households that already shared a bull and a burial ground and half a set of grandparents, would have brought a certain shake of the head at both supper tables, and Walter, from what we can see of him at 22, was a young man who did not care to have heads shaken at him. He preferred to arrange matters where no one was watching, and to be seen, in the sight of the parish, doing what a respectable man of his age was expected to do. Let me hold on that word for a breath, because it will come back. Respectable. It runs through every account of Walter Horsford written before or after his death, and it hides more than it shows. In a Huntingdonshire village of that decade, to be respectable was to keep the outward shape of a decent life. The pew on a Sunday, the rent paid on time, the boots polished, the wife properly clothed, the children properly fed. It said nothing about the inward shape at all. A respectable man might be tender to his family or hard on them, patient with his workers or a slow bully to them, honest at the market or a quiet cheat, and none of it would show in the phrase. The parish used the word to mean, more or less, gives us no trouble to think about. Walter, on all outward measures, gave the parish no trouble to think about at all. What he gave Annie Holmes, on the Wheatfield headland on a Wednesday afternoon, is a matter the parish did not know it needed to think about until it was too late. I have to be honest with you here. Some of what I am going to describe now, in the middle of this chapter, is reconstructed rather than recorded. When I say that Walter, on a particular winter evening, waited at the stile from 4:30 until dusk before going home, that is the sort of thing his hired man later described to a solicitor in Kimbolton, in a general way, without giving a date. When I say that Annie, in the summer of 1891, was seen twice on the same Sunday, walking back from the Horsford dairy with no basket at all, that is a remark that survives in a letter written by a Stowe neighbour to her sister in Cambridge, and it is the sort of remark that in a country parish never had to be explained. Where the record is firm, I will say so. Where it is soft, I will say that too. The record is firm on this. By 1892, at latest, both families knew. Walter's mother had spoken to Annie's mother on a visit to Stowe in a dog-cart in the spring, and had come home with her mouth pressed thin, and had said nothing to her husband about the visit at all. Annie's father had spoken to Walter's father at the Michaelmas rent day in Huntingdon, in a public house on the market square, and had come out again with his hat set on tighter than it had been when he went in. Neither man told the other what had been said. Neither wife told her sister-in-law what had been agreed. But from that autumn onwards, the invitations between the two farmhouses grew a little cooler at the edges. The Holmes family came less often to the pew at St. James. The Horsfords sent a hired man rather than Walter himself when a message needed carrying to Stowe. It was not a break, it was a stiffening. In a country parish, a stiffening between two households that had for 20 years been in and out of each other's kitchens without knocking is a thing every neighbour reads at once, and no neighbour comments on for at least a year. Come back with me now to the stile. It is worth going back to it once more, because after the stiffening of the families, it did not, for a while, stop being used. If anything, through the winter of 1892 and the spring that followed, the meetings on the Wheatfield headland became more frequent, not less. Walter, who had been meeting Annie once a fortnight, began to meet her once a week. Annie, who had been walking the path on Wednesday afternoons, began to walk it on other days as well, always with a basket, always with a stated errand, always in the direction of Spaldwick, and never quite as far as the shop. The hedge along Rans's field was thick with May blossom that spring, and heavy with sloes by the autumn, and to a walker coming along it in the low sun, the two figures at the stile would have looked, at any distance, like exactly what they were and exactly what they were pretending not to be at the same time. I want to set something down plainly here, because it will matter later. There is nothing in the surviving record, not in a letter, not in a court paper, not in a neighbour's remark years afterward, that says Walter and Annie were, in this period, anything more than two people meeting to talk at a stile. Whatever passed between them in body, and I will not guess at that, did not pass in any place where a witness could see it, and the writing on it in the newspapers of 1898, when the whole story broke, is the sort of writing that has to be treated with great care. Country papers of that year had a fondness for the word improper that told the reader nothing at all. What we can say is that a private understanding had grown up between them, that both families now knew of it and did not name it, and that neither of the two young people had done anything, formally, to bring the understanding into the light. That was Walter's choice more than Annie's. This is the piece that will matter later, and I want to place it gently now, without pressing on it. A young woman in a Huntingdonshire farmhouse in 1892, in an attachment of this kind, had almost no way to force the matter into the open by herself. If her cousin would not come and speak to her father, she could not go and speak to her father herself, without a scandal that would end the attachment before it began. Her only weapon, if she chose to use it, was to withdraw, to stop meeting at the stile, to send a message she would not walk that way any more, to require Walter to come across the fields to Stow in daylight, hat in hand, and ask for her in front of her mother. That weapon Annie Holmes did not use. Whether from love, or from hope, or from the plain lack of a language in which to use it, she did not use it. She kept walking to the stile, and Walter kept meeting her there, and the parish kept its counsel, and the months went on. What we do not know, and what I do not think anyone will ever know now, is what Walter told her in that time about his own plans. Whether he promised her, in so many words, that he would in the end come across to Stow with his hat in his hand. Whether he told her, more honestly, that his mother had set her mind against it, and that they would have to wait. Whether he told her nothing at all, and let her build the promise for herself out of 1.5 years of Wednesday afternoons. The letters that would later come out at the trial, and I will come to those in their proper place, all belong to the last winter of Annie's life. From this earlier period, nothing in either hand survives. The wheat field along Rans's headland is now under a different rotation, and the stile itself was taken down before the Second War and never replaced, and whatever was said across it went with it. Toward the end of that time, in the summer of 1893, a change came into the pattern that neither Annie nor the parish had reason to expect. Walter Horsford began to be seen, on market days in Kimbolton, in the company of another young woman. Her name was Kate. She was not from Spaldwick, and she was not from Stow, and she had no cousinship to either family. She came from a village a few miles further off, of a farming household of the same middling sort as his own, and she was, by the account of those who saw them together on the market square that summer, a fair young woman with a good bonnet and a level way of returning a greeting. Walter walked with her at the horse fair in July. He was seen with her at the harvest supper at her father's farm in September. In October, at the church of her own parish, the banns were called for the first time. Annie Holmes, at Stow Longer, would have heard the news through her mother, who would have had it from a neighbour, who would have had it from the woman who sold the tea. It is not recorded what Annie said when she heard. It is not recorded whether she went out that afternoon along the path toward the stile, or whether she stayed in the kitchen with her hands in the wash-tub and did not look up. What is recorded is that the meetings at the stile stopped, in that autumn, as completely as if the stile itself had been taken away. Walter's cart, on its way home from Kimbolton, went back to using the shorter road through Barham. Annie's Wednesday errands to Spaldwick were sent, from that October onwards, in the hands of a younger sister. The wheatfield headland grew over with grass, and by the following spring you would not have known that anyone had walked it at all. The parish, watching all of this with the sidelong attention it kept for such things, drew its own conclusion and put the matter away. A cousinship that had almost tipped into something more had been tidied back into a cousinship again. A young man had done the sensible thing and married outside the family. A young woman had been let down, without ceremony, in the way young women in country parishes were let down every year. The world would go on. That was the reading, at Stow and at Spaldwick, in the winter of 1893. In the ordinary run of things, that would have been the end of it. Walter would have taken his new wife to a farmhouse of their own, and settled to the work of his own tenancy, and grown into the respected middle-aged tenant his father had been before him. Annie would have stayed at her mother's settle through her middle-20s, and in due course either married a farmer's son from Catworth, or from Great Staunton, or would not have married at all, and would have gone on skimming cream and pressing butter with the thistle mould, and in either case the two names, Horsford and Holmes, would have stayed close in the parish register, and no closer. That is not what happened, and the reason it is not what happened is that neither Walter nor Annie in that October, actually put the thing down. They stopped meeting at the stile. They stopped walking the Wheatfield headland. But between two people who have spent a year and a half in a private understanding and then let it drop without ever speaking of it, an understanding of a different kind remains. Walter, at his new farm with his new wife, still knew that at Stow Longer, in a kitchen he could reach in an hour across the fields, sat a woman who had walked to that stile every Wednesday of a year and a half and had never asked him for a promise she could hold him to. Annie, at her mother's settle with her sewing on her lap, still knew that at Spaldwick, in a house she could see the smoke of on a cold morning from her own yard, lived a cousin who had never quite finished what he had begun to say. And between them, along the 3 miles of flat country, and the paths across the fields, an old attachment had gone underground rather than gone away, and would in due course come up again, and would come up in a form neither of them, on that autumn afternoon, could yet have named. A wife at the farmhouse. Let me stay with Walter for a moment before we cross the fields to see him settled at his new place. It helps to remember the shape of him as he was in that autumn of 1893, because the man who walks into a marriage is never quite the same man who walks out of it a year later, and the difference in Walter Horsford, small as it was to the neighbours, would matter a great deal by the end. He was 23 when the banns were called at Kate's parish church, tall for the country, with brown hair worn short at the sides, and a way of standing with his weight set on one foot and the other easy behind him that his hired man remembered years afterward as the mark of him at any distance. He kept his coat brushed. He shaved on a Saturday night and again on a Wednesday morning. He was, in the parish phrase, a well-turned-out young farmer, and the woman he was about to marry had, so far as anyone at Kimbolton Market could see, done herself no harm at all by accepting him. Her name in full was Catherine, but she went by Kate in her own family, and would go by Kate in his. She was 2 years younger than Walter, which is to say 21 at the wedding, and she came from a farm at a village further to the northeast, in the direction of Ramsey, on ground a little heavier than the ground at Spaldwick, and a little wetter in the winter. Her father held roughly the same acreage as Walter's father. Her mother kept the same kind of dairy. There was a younger brother expected to take on the home place in due course, and 2 older sisters already married into farms of their own, and so Kate, in the arithmetic of a country family, was the daughter it was time to send out. None of this, I should say, is guesswork. The parish papers survive for both households, and the marriage entry survives at her church, and a photograph of the 2 of them, taken on a plate by a Kimbolton photographer within a month of the wedding, was reproduced in a Cambridge paper years later when the whole story broke. In that photograph, Kate stands a little in front of Walter, in a dark dress with a high collar and a brooch at her throat, and her hand rests on the back of the chair he is seated in. His hand is on his knee. Neither of them is smiling, because no one smiled in a country photograph of that decade, but her chin is lifted and his eyes are level with the camera, and it is the picture of a young couple who mean the marriage to hold. They were married in the last week of October, in 1893, at her own parish church, with her father giving her and Walter's father standing beside him in a black coat that had been made for a burial 10 years before. Walter's mother sat in the front pew on the family side and did not turn her head when the bride came in. That last detail is not a novelist's touch. It was noted afterward by a woman of Kate's family in a letter to her married sister in Peterborough, and the letter has survived in a private collection at the County Record Office, and it is one of the small pieces of ordinary evidence that a story of this kind depends on. The wedding breakfast was held at Kate's father's farm, in the barn cleared for the purpose, with trestles set along the length of it and lanterns hung from the beams. Kate's mother had roasted 3 geese and a piece of beef, and had baked a cake in a tin the size of a milk pail. The vicar came, and the schoolmaster from her village, and a cousin of hers who was a corn merchant at Ramsey, and had brought a hamper of something better than farm cider. Nobody from Stow Longer was there. That was not remarked on at the breakfast, because it was not a wedding at which the presence of the bride's husband's mother's brother's family would have been expected as a matter of course. It is only remarked on now, at the distance of more than 100 years, because we know what we know, and because the absence of the Holmeses from that barn is a piece of the pattern, that had been forming for 18 months. Now, come with me across the fields to the farm Walter was taking. It lay a little way off the road between Kimbolton and Spaldwick, on ground his father had helped him toward with a word to the agent in Huntingdon, and it was not, by any measure, a grand place. The house was of the same red brick as the Horsford home place, with the same pantile roof, but it was set at an odd angle to the yard, because the yard had been laid out for a different house that had burned down 40 years before. There was a barn behind, and a stable for 2 horses, and a lean-to dairy at the back of the kitchen with a stone floor and a shelf for the setting pans. The lease ran to something over 160 acres of mixed ground, with a strip of osier along the brook at the far end that brought in a few pounds a year for basket work at Huntingdon. The rent at the audit day came to £110 a year, payable half at Michaelmas and half at Lady Day, and Walter had the promise of his father's help through the first 2 rent days if the harvest went against him. Into this house, in the first week of November, Walter brought his wife. The furniture had gone in ahead of them by cart the day before, a bedstead of stained oak from his mother's spare room, a dresser Kate's mother had spared from the dairy at home, a settle from a sale at Buckden, a table that was new. Kate carried in her own hands, wrapped in a cloth, a china tea service that had been a present from her aunts, and a Bible in a leather cover with her name on the flyleaf in the vicar's writing, and a pair of brass candlesticks that would stand on the parlour mantel for the rest of her married life. Walter carried the ledger he meant to keep for the farm, and a new inkwell, and a bundle of the previous tenant's papers that the agent had passed on to him. It was the ordinary loading in of an ordinary young couple, and if you had watched them from the yard that afternoon, you would have said, without hesitation, that they meant well by each other and by the place. Kate took to the running of the house at once. This is not a matter of guesswork either. The hired girl who came in from the village 3 mornings a week for the heavy work spoke to a solicitor in Kimbolton years later and gave a plain account of the household as she had known it in that first winter. The floors were scrubbed, the linen was washed on a Monday and ironed on a Tuesday. The dairy was set up on the pattern of Kate's mother's dairy, with the pans stood in the same order and the cheesecloths hung on the same kind of rack. Bread was baked twice a week. A hot dinner was on the table at 12:30 when Walter came in from the yard, and a plate of cold meat and pickle was set on the dresser for him if the work of a market day kept him out. She was, by every account we have of her, a good manager and a steady wife, and Walter, in that first year, gave the village no reason at all to think he was anything but a fortunate young man. It is worth pausing here to be honest with you about what we do not know. The inside of a marriage is the thing history preserves worst. We have the outside of this one in tolerable detail. The acreage, the rent, the pattern of the house, the visitors at the door on a Sunday afternoon. We have almost nothing from either of them about what was said between them when the parlour door was shut. There is one letter from Kate to her mother, written in the March of 1894, in which she says the house is dry, and the range draws well, and Walter is kind to her, and that is the whole of it. There are no letters from Walter of that year that survive at all. Whether he was as easy in that parlour as he seemed at the market, whether he came in at night and sat in a chair by the range with his boots off and spoke of the day, whether he lay awake beside his young wife and thought of a stile at the far end of a wheat field he had stopped walking to, none of that is in the record, and I will not pretend it is. What is in the record is that the outward life of the farmhouse held its shape week after week, through that first year and into the second, and that Kate, from every sign the village could read, believed herself to be safely married. Come back with me for a moment now to Stow longer, because we cannot leave Annie for the whole of a chapter and pretend the story is only Walter's. The Holmes household went on as it had gone on. Annie's father held the same acreage. Her mother kept the same dairy. The 2 brothers were out in the fields with their father, and the younger sister was learning the churn under her mother's hand, and Annie, in the ordinary run of a country daughter's life in her middle 20s, might have been expected in that winter to be already spoken for by a young man of a farm at Catworth or Great Staunton, and to be already turning the corner of her own courtship into her own wedding. She was not. The neighbours at Stow noticed. In a parish of that size, an unmarried woman of 25 with no attachment named at the church door is a fact everyone can count on the fingers of a hand, and Annie Holmes, in the winter of 1893 and through the whole of 1894, was one of them. She went to church every Sunday. She sat in her mother's pew, on the north side, in the same bonnet she had worn the year before, with the ribbon retied and a fresh line of trim at the crown. She curtsied to the vicar at the door. She stopped for a word with the schoolmistress on the path. And she went home along the same lane she had walked as a girl, and turned in at her father's gate, and hung her bonnet on the peg in the passage, and set about the afternoon's work with her mother in the kitchen, as if nothing at all in her own life needed remarking on. 2 or 3 of the older women of the parish, in a way old women in country parishes have always had, tried to move the matter along. A cousin was mentioned once, from a farm near Alconbury. A widower of 40, with 2 small boys and a decent house, was hinted at through her mother by a friend at market. A curate was thought of, briefly, and then thought better of. Nothing came of any of it. Whether Annie refused, gently and without a word to anyone, or whether her mother refused on her behalf, or whether the young men themselves, hearing something in the parish they could not quite name, drew back without ever making a move, is not a thing the record shows. It is only that no attachment formed. The pew on the north side held the same 3 faces every Sunday. The bonnet on the peg in the passage was the same bonnet. I think, though I cannot prove, that Annie was waiting, not with any plan she could have named, and not with any hope she could have carried to another woman in the parish and asked for advice on, only with the plain fact that a year and a half of Wednesday afternoons at a stile had not left her, and could not be talked out of her by an aunt with a cousin at Alconbury in mind. She had, by every account we have of her later, a habit of steadiness in whatever she undertook. She had been a steady scholar at the parish school. She was a steady worker in the dairy. She would, it seems, be a steady waiter too, without ever calling it waiting, and without ever telling her mother that was what she was doing, and without asking herself, on the long evenings in front of the range, what exactly she was waiting for. Between the 2 houses, in that first year of Walter's marriage, there was very little traffic. The old visits on a Sunday afternoon did not resume. A message about a bull was carried once, in the spring, by a hired man of Walter's who did not stop in the Holmes kitchen for tea. A card at Christmas passed in each direction, in Kate's hand from the one side and in Annie's mother's hand from the other, and both cards were kept on a mantelpiece for the 12 days, and then put away. Walter did not go to Stow himself in the whole of that year. Annie did not go to Spaldwick. The lane between the villages was walked, in 1894, by cousins and neighbours and drovers, and the woman who sold tea, but not by either of the 2 people who had once walked it every week. And so, on the outside, the tidying that the parish had done in the autumn of 1893 held. Walter was a married man at his own farm. Kate was a well-set young wife in a well-kept house. Annie was a daughter at her mother's settle, unmarried at 26, then 27, then 28. The 2 farmhouses stood where they had stood. The Michaelmas rents were paid on time at both. The pantile roofs shed the rain of 2 winters, and the flat fields between the villages went from stubble to plough to green shoots to gold 3 times over, and to any passing eye, the story of the Horsfords and the Holmeses had closed itself back into the ordinary story of 2 country families who had almost, and had not quite, become one. Underneath, of course, the ordinary story had not closed at all. Walter, at the head of his own table, still knew that at Stow Longer sat a woman who had asked him for no promise she could hold him to. Annie, at her mother's settle, still knew that at the farmhouse beyond Kimbolton lived a cousin who had never quite finished what he had begun to say. Neither of them wrote to the other in those years. Neither of them, so far as the record shows, sent a message that could not have been sent by any cousin to any cousin in a country parish in the ordinary run of things. Whatever ran between them ran below the surface of the 2 houses, along the paths and the field edges, without a word being spoken. It would need only a small thing to bring it up again, a change in Annie's health that her mother could not account for, a remark at a market that carried, without meaning to, from one side of Kimbolton to the other, a letter, folded once and set on a hall table, in a hand that a servant might recognise. It would need only one of these, in a season when the weather turned in on the flat country, and the evenings came down early over the fields, and the tidying of a whole year and more would come undone at the seam. That season was not far off now. The winter of 1897 was already forming somewhere out over the North Sea, and the ordinary rural post between Spaldwick and Stow Longer was already, without knowing it, waiting for the folded paper it would soon be asked to carry. The letter in the winter post. Come with me now into the last weeks of the year 1897. It is easier to see this part of the story if you first stand outside the two farmhouses in the cold, before we go in at either door. The flat country between Spaldwick and Stow Longer is dun brown and iron under a low sky. The hedges have been cut back to the quick. Rooks sit in the leaning elms along the lane and do not lift when a cart goes past. Somewhere out over the North Sea, the weather is already forming that will bring frost to the pump handles by Christmas Eve, and rain to every gutter through the second week of the new year. Walter Horsford is 27 that winter. He has been at his own farm for a little over 4 years now, married to Kate the whole time, and to the neighbours he is what he has always been, a well-turned-out tenant, respectable at Michaelmas rent day, level at the market in Kimbleton, careful with a ledger. Kate is 25. There are no children yet at the farm beyond Kimbleton, and there is a shape to that silence that Kate's mother, in a letter to her married sister at Peterborough, refers to only sideways, as a matter for the doctor and for prayer. What Walter thought of it, I do not know. He left no letter of his own on that subject, then or later. At Stow Longer, Annie Holmes is 29 years old. She has never been engaged. She keeps her father's dairy alongside her mother, and she goes to church on the north side of the pew in the same bonnet she has worn for 3 winters, with the trim replaced twice and the ribbon retied. She has grown, in that half-decade, into a woman the parish had settled on calling Steady Annie, which was as close as a country parish came, in that year, to saying that a woman would not now be marrying at all. Then, somewhere between harvest and Christmas of 1897, Annie's mother notices what Annie has been keeping from her. The record on this is thinner than I would like. What we have is a remark Annie's mother made to her sister-in-law in the kitchen at Stow, a week or so before the first letter is known to have passed. Annie had been unwell in the mornings for a month. She had gone off her tea. Her dress at the waist had been let out once already, and would need letting out again. Her mother, who had brought 5 living children into the world, and had lost 2 before their first winter, did not need a doctor to tell her what she was looking at. She did not raise her voice. She did not send for the vicar. She sat down with Annie in the parlour on a Wednesday afternoon, with the rain shut down and the room cold, and she asked her daughter a plain question, and Annie, who had waited 5 years to be asked, told her. It was Walter. Whether Annie said, in that parlour, exactly when the meetings had resumed, and where, and how often, is not on the record. What survives is only the fact that she named him, and that her mother sat with the answer for the whole of that afternoon and told no one, not her husband, not the 2 brothers in the yard, not the younger sister at the dairy door, until the following morning. When she did speak, she spoke first not to Annie's father, and not to the vicar, and not to any relation of her own. She spoke to Annie again, and she said that a letter would have to be written to Walter at once, and that Annie, in the writing of it, was to leave nothing important out. Come with me for a moment across the fields now, to the desk in the parlour at Walter's farmhouse. That desk is one of the few pieces of furniture in this story we can be sure of, because it was described at the trial. It stood under the window that faced the yard, with a green cloth on its top, and an inkwell of brown glass, and a blotter Kate had made from a piece of leftover baize. Walter kept his ledger on it, his rent papers, and a bundle of correspondence held together with a length of tape. It is at that desk, at some point in the first week of December in 1897, that the first letter from Stow Longer reached him. We do not have the letter. Neither Annie's nor her mother's overseeing hand in it survived past the events that followed. What we know of it comes from Walter's own answers on the packet that came later, and from a remark he made in a very different room on a very different day, when the whole story was long out of his keeping. Annie had told him she was with child, that the child was his, that her mother knew, and that a course would have to be settled between them before the household at Stowe could hold itself together any further. I want to hold on this for a breath, because it is the seam of the whole story, and I want to be careful not to slide past it. A young unmarried woman in a Huntingdonshire farmhouse in the last month of 1897, 6 months gone by her own reckoning, has almost no doors open to her. She cannot go to her father with a plan of her own. She cannot go to the vicar without the parish knowing by Sunday. She cannot go into Kimbolton to a doctor she does not know. Every door in her situation opens onto the next door, and each door costs her more than the last. The only door she can push against without the whole parish hearing the hinge is the door of a letter to the man responsible, and that is the door Annie's mother, sitting across the parlour table with her hands in her lap, pushed her toward on that Wednesday afternoon. What Annie hoped for, in the writing of it, we can only guess. Perhaps she hoped Walter would come. Perhaps she hoped he would arrange for her to be sent to an aunt at Peterborough for a season, and for the child to be given out, and for her to be brought back home in the spring. Perhaps she hoped, more than any of the sensible things a countrywoman was allowed to hope, that he would find a way to acknowledge the child under his own name, though what that way could be, with Kate still alive at the farm beyond Kimbolton, no one in either kitchen could have said. She was, by every account of her, not a foolish woman. She would have known, before she signed her name at the bottom of the sheet, that the letter was a door she could push on, and no more. What Walter did, when the letter reached him, is the piece of the record we know best, and the piece I would most like not to have to tell you. He did not write back at once. He did not go to Stowe. He did not sit at the parlour table with Kate and speak the truth of what he had done. What he did, so far as the record can tell us, is that he sat at the desk under the window in the yard-facing parlour, and he thought. I have stood at that farmhouse. The house is still there, though the yard has been paved and the barn is a store now, and I would rather not tell you exactly where it is. The window in the parlour faces east. In the second week of December, it would have taken the light from about 8:30 in the morning until a little after 2 in the afternoon, and after that, the room would have needed the range and a candle drawn up onto the desk itself. Whatever thinking Walter did between the arrival of Annie's letter and the writing of his answer was done in that light and in that later candlelight. What he told Kate about the letter that had come and gone from his hand, no one has ever known. It is possible he told her nothing. It is possible he told her it was a farm matter from Stowe that he would see to. His answer went by the ordinary rural post before the week was out. That first reply, and there would be, on the record, at least 4 letters from him to Stowe between then and the middle of January, did not send anything more than words. It asked Annie to be patient. It asked her not to tell her father until he had had time to think. It said that he understood the seriousness of what she had written, and that he would find a way, and that she was not to speak to anyone in the parish beyond her mother. It was, from what we can gather of it, the letter of a man who is buying himself time, and does not yet know what he means to buy the time for. Come back with me to the kitchen at Stowe. Annie's mother read that first answer, and she was, by every account of her afterward, dissatisfied. Buying time was not what she had asked her daughter to write for. She sat with Annie again, in the same parlour with the same shut range, and she dictated the terms of the second letter, and Annie wrote them down. This one was firmer. It asked what Walter meant to do. It named the month the child was expected, May of the coming year, and it named, without pressing, the fact that Annie's father would in due course have to be told, and that when he was told he would want a plain answer to give. Walter's second reply came by return. It was longer. It spoke of an aunt of Kate's, up beyond Ramsey, whose house Kate would in the spring be visiting for a fortnight. It spoke of a farmhouse at Alconbury Weston, empty for the winter, where he could arrange for Annie to be seen by a doctor from Huntingdon, who kept his own counsel. It spoke of money. He named a sum, £12 to begin with, and more if the doctor at Huntingdon required it, and he said he would find a way to send it without the parish at Stowe knowing of any transfer. He asked Annie, at the end of the letter, to trust him. He signed it, as he signed all 4 of the letters that came to be produced later, only with the initial of his given name. I want to be honest here about something the trial would in due course press hard on. There is no line in any of Walter's letters, not the first, not the second, and not the 2 that followed, in which he speaks of the powder. There is no line in Annie's letters, so far as we can reconstruct them, in which she asks for one. On the surface of the correspondence, right through Christmas and into the new year of 1898, Walter is offering money, and a doctor, and a place at Alconbury Weston, and time. Annie is asking, in return, only that her father not be shamed, and that the child be provided for. The letters, if you read the surviving accounts of them side by side, do not read, on their face, as the letters of a man planning what he was about to do. And yet, in the second week of January, in the same week the last of the letters passed between the two farmhouses, Walter Horsford went into Kimbolton on a market day, walked into the shop of a chemist named Reddell on the High Street, and bought, over the counter, a quantity of strychnine. He signed the poison register in his own name, in his own hand, in the ordinary way any farmer in that country signed for strychnine that year, and he gave the stated purpose, which was, and I take this from the ledger itself, preserved to this day at the County Record Office, the destruction of rats in a granary. He put the packet in the inside pocket of his coat, and he walked out onto the High Street of Kimbolton, and he went home along the shorter road through Barham, and he sat down that evening at the desk in the parlour under the yard-facing window, and he wrote what would be his last letter to Stowe. We do not have that letter either, though we have, from Annie's mother's later evidence, a clear enough account of what it said. It told Annie that a paper packet would come to her, hidden inside a folded sheet by the ordinary rural post. It told her to take what was inside the packet in a little water, at night, in her own room, after the household was asleep. It told her that it would bring on what needed to be brought on, and that the trouble would pass by morning, and that no one, not even her mother, need know she had taken anything at all. It told her, as the earlier letters had told her, to trust him. Annie's mother had by then, I should say, been reading each letter as it came in, and answering back in Annie's hand across the kitchen table. But the last letter, by an accident of the post and the day of the week, was brought in by the younger sister on a Saturday afternoon when Annie's mother was at the market in Kimbolton, and Annie took the letter from her sister at the passage door and read it in her own room, and did not, in the 2 evenings that followed, show it to her mother at all. What she thought when she read it, whether she was frightened, whether she was already at that hour so far past the reach of any sensible course that another door offered from the man responsible looked, in her tiredness and her fear, like the only door she could push on now, none of that is in the record, and I will not put it there. What is in the record is that the folded paper packet came, as promised, on the ordinary rural post in the last week of January, in the year 1898. It was brought up the lane to the Holmes farmhouse by the postman, who came out from Kimbolton 3 mornings a week, along with a bill for a coal merchant and a card from a cousin at Peterborough, and it was set with the rest on the hall table by the younger sister. Annie took it up to her room without a word. She put it in the drawer of the little painted table beside her bed, and she set the letter that had come with it on top of it, folded twice, and shut the drawer. The lamp on that table would be lit again on the night of the last day of January. The dog at the kitchen door would begin to whine at some point after midnight, and would not be quieted. And the clock on the shelf in the room upstairs at Stowe Longer was already, without knowing it, counting toward the hour it would strike as Annie Holmes reached for the cup. The powder and the cup. Come with me, then, to the last day of January, in the year 1898. It is a Monday. The sky over Stowe Longer has hung grey since morning and has begun, by 4 in the afternoon, to bring down the fine kind of rain that does not sound on the pantile roof of a Huntingdonshire farmhouse, but only darkens the stones of the yard, and by 6 o'clock the lane between the Holmes place and the church is running black under the gate. Annie Holmes has been on her feet in the dairy since dawn. She has stood the setting pans, and helped her mother with the churn, and gone in at midday for a plate of bread and cold mutton she has eaten only half of. Her mother has watched her without seeming to watch her, in the way a country mother has always watched a daughter she is afraid for. I want to tell you what Annie was thinking that afternoon. I cannot. There is no letter of hers from that day, and there is no line in her mother's later evidence that speaks to it. What we can say is only what other women in a like case have written about, in years both before and after, and even that will only carry us so far. Annie was 29. She was 6 months gone by her own reckoning. She had a folded packet in the drawer of the painted table by her bed, and a letter that told her what to do with it, and she had told no one in her house about either. Supper at the Holmes farmhouse was set at 6:30. Her father came in from the yard. Her 2 brothers came in behind him, one older than she was and one younger, and the younger sister brought the pot from the range. Annie sat in her place at the long side of the table and drank a cup of tea and ate what she could. Her mother, from the head of the table, spoke to her once about a bolt of cloth that had come out of Kimbolton the day before, and Annie answered without lifting her eyes. Her father read a piece of the county paper aloud, as he did most nights, and no one at the table said anything that would be remembered afterwards for its meaning. The dishes were washed by 9. The younger sister took her sewing to the settle by the range. Both brothers went out with a lantern to see to a mare that had been off her feed. Annie's mother sat in the parlour, with the Bible open in her lap, and did not read it. Annie herself sat for perhaps 3/4 of an hour at the kitchen table with a shirt of her father's she had been mending, and then, at some hour close to 10, she folded the shirt and set it on the dresser, and she said good night, and she went up the narrow back stairs to her room. "Come up the stairs with me for a moment, without going in. The landing at Stow Longer is not more than 4 paces long. There is a window at the far end that looks out onto the yard, and a rag mat on the boards, and 3 doors, the parents' room at the head of the stairs, the younger sister's room on the left, and Annie's own room on the right, above the pantry, with a floor that ran a hand's breadth lower than the rest. That last detail is not for atmosphere. It matters, because when Annie's mother later crossed that landing in her bare feet, the step down into her daughter's room was the reason she did not go straight to the bed, but caught herself first against the frame of the door. For now, though, the house is only turning in for the night. The dog in the kitchen has settled in his basket by the range. A rushlight burns on the landing, in a tin holder shaped like a rose. Annie closes the door of her room behind her, and she draws the bolt across, which was not her custom, and she lights the oil lamp on the painted table by the bed, and she stands for a length of time no one will ever know the measure of, in front of the drawer. The letter she had by then read many times. The packet inside it was, from Walter's description of what he had wanted from the chemist, and from what the chemist's ledger at Kimbolton records, a folded paper of the kind that packet powders came in, white, thumb-sized, with the edges tucked in the manner of an apothecary who did not want the powder inside spilling into the pocket of a coat. It had lain in the drawer for 6 days. She took it out. She set it beside the lamp. She fetched from the washstand the china cup her aunt at Peterborough had sent her as a girl. She poured, from the jug on the stand, a measure of water into the cup, no more than half full, which is what the letter had told her to use. And she stood in her nightdress in the middle of the room, in front of the table, and she opened the paper. The powder inside was white. That much we know from the packet Walter would in due course make up on the trial day for the jury, from what remained in his own supply, at the request of the prosecution, and under the eye of a chemist from Cambridge. Strychnine in that form is bitter, and the letter had warned her of that also, and had told her to swallow the water down at once, and to lie back on the pillows and to think of nothing. She emptied the powder into the water. She stirred it, most likely with the handle of a hairpin, because a spoon on that table is not mentioned in the evidence, and a hairpin was found on the washstand afterwards with the tip of it dulled. She lifted the cup. She drank. Then she blew out the lamp. Let me hold on the next hour with you, because it is the hour of the whole story, and because the record for it is, by the measure of a country death in that year, unusually full. What we have comes from 3 people. It comes from Annie's mother, who gave evidence at the inquest and again at the Assizes. It comes from the doctor from Kimbolton, whose name was Talbot, and who was called at close to 1 in the morning, and whose written statement survives in the file. And it comes from the younger sister, who was 15 years old that winter, and who was the first person in the house to know that anything was wrong. The younger sister slept, as I have said, in the room across the landing. She was woken, at what she believed later to have been about 11:20, by a sound she took at first for the dog. It was not the dog. It was a low, clenched cry from her sister's room, followed by the noise of a body moving against the iron bedstead, and then a hush, and then the same cry again. She got out of bed. She went to the landing. She stood at the door of her sister's room and called Annie's name, and got no answer. She tried the door and found the bolt drawn. She went then to her parents' room, and she woke her mother. Annie's mother crossed the landing in her bare feet. She caught herself on the frame of her daughter's door, because of the step I mentioned, and she called through the boards. Annie did not answer. Her mother put her shoulder to the door. She was a strong woman, brought up in a country dairy, and the bolt gave at the second try. The oil lamp on the table was out. There was only the rushlight from the landing behind her. What she saw, by that thin light, was her daughter on the bed, with her back arched clear of the mattress, and her arms locked out straight to the sides, and her face turned toward the wall, and every muscle of her body drawn as tight as a rope wound on a windlass. I do not want to press hard on the physical detail of what strychnine does to a person, because you are lying somewhere in the dark tonight and are trying to rest, and it will not help you to know. What I will tell you is only the outline of it, plainly. It works upon the nerves that carry a signal to the muscles, and it takes off the natural check on those signals, so that any touch, a hand on the wrist, a movement of the covers, a foot on a floorboard, will set the whole body into a spasm that the person inside it cannot govern. Between the spasms, the person is awake and knows what is happening and can speak. Annie, when her mother came to the side of the bed, could speak and did. What she said was not remembered by her mother in the exact words, and no one else in the house was in the room, and I would rather not put words in her mouth that were not put there by a witness. Her mother's evidence at the Assizes was only this, that her daughter told her the packet was on the table, and the letter with it, and that Walter had sent them, and that she had done what the letter said. Then another spasm came, and the sentence ended, and Annie's mother went out onto the landing, and shouted for her husband, and for the elder of the two boys, and the household came awake. The elder brother was sent, in his coat and his boots and no waistcoat, on the horse he had been up to feed at midnight, along the 4-mile road into Kimbleton, to fetch the doctor. He rode the mare hard. He came into the yard of Dr. Talbot at 12:30. The doctor was already dressed, having been out earlier in the evening to a farm at Tilbrook for a child with the croup, and he ordered the horse to be put to his own gig, and he took his bag from the shelf in the passage, and he came at once. He knew the road. He drove himself. He was on the road at about 10 minutes to 1, and the road that night was mud to the axle at the low places, and running with the rain that had been coming down since tea time. At the farmhouse, the two women waited. Annie's father had gone into the room and had come out again. He was not a man made for the sight of a spasm, and his wife had told him to keep to the landing and to keep the younger children back. He did as she said. Annie's mother sat on the floor at the head of the bed, because to sit on the bed itself was to set off another spasm, and she spoke to her daughter between the fits in the level, coaxing voice she had used through 5 childbirths in that house, and she wet a cloth from the jug on the washstand, and held it, at arm's length, to Annie's forehead when a fit had passed. In the intervals, Annie asked for her mother. She asked, once, for her father to be kept out. She asked for the light to be raised, and, at the last, she asked for the letter to be put into the range. Dr. Talbot came into the yard at 20 minutes past 1. He had made better time than any man had a right to make on that road on that night. The elder brother was at the gate to take the mare. The doctor came up the back stairs 2 at a time with his bag in his hand, and he set the bag on the landing, and he crossed into the room. He was too late by, at his own estimate afterwards, no more than 8 or 10 minutes. The last spasm had come at a little after 1, and had held Annie in its grip for the length of it that a person, in that condition, cannot draw breath, and when it had eased, she had not drawn breath again. The doctor did what a doctor of that year could do, which was almost nothing. He listened for a heart. He held a candle to the eye. He straightened the arms, which had already begun to slacken from the last spasm, and would in a few minutes be entirely slack again, in the way of that particular poison, he said to Annie's mother, in a voice that has been preserved because his own written statement carried the words, that he was very sorry, and that there was nothing more that he could do, and that he would have to send in due course for the constable at Kimbleton and for the coroner's officer. The letter, at that hour, was still folded on the painted table beside the bed. The packet was on the table beside it. The cup, half of the water still in it and the sediment of the powder settled at the bottom, stood on the washstand where Annie had set it down at 10:30. The mother had not put any of the three of them into the range, and would not, and had not told the doctor yet that her daughter had asked her to. She only stood at the foot of the bed with her hands folded in front of her, and she looked at the letter, and she said, in a voice pitched only for the doctor and no one else, that the writing on it was her sister's boy's, and that his name was Walter Horsford, and that he had a farm out beyond Kimbolton, and that a message had best be sent for the constable at once. Outside, in the yard, the rain had thinned toward morning. The dog at the kitchen door had ceased to whine at some point in the last hour, and had gone back into his basket. The lamp on the landing was still burning. The elder brother had gone out to the mare, and was rubbing her down under the eaves of the barn with a piece of old sacking, and had not yet been told. The doctor's gig stood in the yard with its lamps still lit, and on the road between Kimbolton and Stow Longer, in the wet grey hour before first light, no one was yet moving who did not know what had happened. But by the time the day was fully up over the flat country, a constable in a wool cape would be walking his horse into the yard of the Holmes farmhouse, and the letter and the packet and the cup, exactly as Annie had left them, would already be waiting on the painted table for the hand that would carry them, in due course, along the wet lanes to the Coroner at Spaldwick. The Coroner at Spaldwick. Come with me back onto that lane, before the sun was fully up. It is easier, in a story like this one, to move a mile at a time on foot than to leap ahead by a day. The rain from the night before had thinned to a mist over the fields at Stow Longer, and the flat country lay dark and wet in every rut. The constable from Kimbolton was a man named George Rowley. He was 41 that winter. He had been in the county force for 19 years, and he had walked or ridden every one of the lanes between Kimbolton and Spaldwick more times than he could have counted. He knew the Holmes farm by its gate, and he knew Annie's father by his hat at market. He rode into the yard at a little after 8 in the morning of the first day of February, in the year 1898, and he took his horse to the ring at the stable wall, and he went in at the back door with his helmet in his hand. Dr. Talbot had waited. He met the constable in the passage, and the two men spoke for a short while at the foot of the back stairs before either of them went up. What passed between them there is not on the record in the exact words, but the substance of it is on the record, because the constable repeated it, weeks later, in a room in Spaldwick with a jury sitting in front of him. The doctor told Rowley what he had seen when he came into the room in the middle of the night. He told him what Annie's mother had told him about the letter and the packet and the sender. He said, in the plain way a country doctor of that year would have said it, that a young woman had been sent a poison by the ordinary post, and that in his settled opinion, without a chemist's confirmation but on the evidence of the body upstairs, that poison had been strychnine, and that the coroner's officer would need to be told at once. Rowley went up the back stairs then, with the doctor behind him. He stopped, as Annie's mother had stopped, at the step down into her daughter's room, and he took a moment on the landing before he crossed the frame. He was, by every account of him, not a hard man. He had 5 children of his own at the police house in Kimbolton. He had been called out to worse rooms in his 19 years, but not, he said in a later statement, to a room quite like this one. Annie was lying now under a clean sheet her mother had drawn up over her at 4 in the morning. The lamp on the painted table had been lit again, the folded packet, the letter, the cup on the washstand. All 3 sat exactly where they had been left. Rowley did not touch any of them at first. He looked, he wrote, in the small notebook he carried in his tunic pocket, a plain list of what was on the table and on the washstand, and where each thing lay. Then he asked Annie's mother, who had come up to the landing behind him, whether the room had been so arranged since the doctor's arrival. She said it had. She said she had covered her daughter with the sheet. She had done nothing else. Rowley took the letter first. He held it by one corner, in the way a man handles a paper he thinks may in due course be shown to a jury, and he read it through. Then he folded it as he had found it, and he slid it into a manila envelope from the inside of his tunic, and he sealed the envelope with a stub of red wax he had warmed at the lamp. He did the same, in his own manner, with the packet. What was left of the powder inside it he did not disturb. He put the packet in a second envelope, and he sealed it, and he numbered both envelopes in pencil on the outside, and he set them on the painted table while he lifted, with equal care, the cup itself. The water in it had not evaporated in the night. The sediment at the bottom was still there. He carried the cup, in both hands, down the back stairs and into the parlour, and he set it in the middle of the parlour table on a folded cloth, and he told Annie's father, who by then was sitting on the settle in the passage in his stockinged feet, that no one was to touch the cup until the coroner's officer had seen it, and until a chemist from Kimbolton had been sent for. Let me stay with the household for a breath before we go on to the village, because the shape of what a country parish did in that year with a death of that kind is not always known now, and it matters here. The coroner for the Huntingdonshire district was a solicitor from Huntingdon named William Wade, who kept an office on the Market Square and who had held the coroner's warrant for the county for the past 14 years. He had a coroner's officer under him, a former sergeant of the county force named Robert Ives, and it was to Ives, and not to Wade himself, that the constable's first message went. Ives received it in Huntingdon at close to 11 in the morning, and he was out on the road by noon, and he was at the Holmes farmhouse in his own gig by the middle of the afternoon. He spent an hour in the room upstairs with the doctor, and another hour in the parlour with the constable, and he took the 2 sealed envelopes and the cup on a folded cloth into his own keeping, and he wrote out, at the parlour table, in a clerk's hand, the order for an inquest to be opened at the schoolroom at Spaldwick on the Friday of that week. Come with me now, out of the farmhouse and along the 3 miles to the village of Spaldwick. It is easier again to walk than to jump. The village lies west of Stow Longer, on the old coach road from Huntingdon to Kimbolton, and in that year it had a church of stone with a tall spire, a public house, a village school on the north side of the green, and a scatter of tenants' cottages set back from the road. The schoolroom on the north side of the green was where the vestry met, and where the parish accounts were audited, and where, on that Friday, the coroner's court was to be held. Ives sent word to Dr. Talbot to attend, and to the chemist Reddell in Kimbolton to attend, and to bring his poison register, and to Annie's mother and father, and to the 2 brothers and the younger sister to attend, and to Rowley in his uniform to attend, and to a jury of 13 men of the parish, chosen in the usual way from among the ratepayers of Spaldwick and its outlying farms, to be summoned by name for 10 o'clock in the morning. I want to be honest at this point about the piece of the record I most wish were fuller. The full transcript of the Spaldwick inquest has not survived. What survives is the coroner's summing up, in Wade's own hand, in the file at the county record office, and a long account of the day published in the county paper on the Saturday following, and a shorter account in a London paper of the Sunday. From those 3 sources it is possible to say, with some confidence, who spoke, and in what order, and what the substance of each piece of evidence was. What is not possible to say is the exact wording of every answer, and I will not pretend that it is. The court opened at 10. The jury were sworn in the schoolroom, sitting on the children's benches drawn up in 3 rows for the day. Wade sat at the master's desk under the window. Ives sat at his elbow with the papers. Rowley stood at the back with his helmet under his arm. The village doctor from Kimbolton came first. He gave, in plain and careful terms, an account of his call to the farmhouse in the night, and of the state of the body when he arrived, and of his own settled belief, drawn from the sight of the room and the description of the fits, that death had been caused by strychnine. He held the cup up, from Ives's table, for the jury to see. He held the sealed packet up. He held the sealed letter up. The jury looked at each in turn, and one of them, an older tenant from a farm out toward Barham, took the cup from the doctor's hand and held it under the light from the window for a longer moment than the others, and set it down again without a word. The chemist Reddell came next. He was a man of about 50 that winter, thin, careful, well-spoken, in a dark suit he had brought out for the occasion. He set his poison register on the master's desk in front of the coroner, and opened it at the leaf for the middle of January. He turned the book so the jury could see the ruled columns for the date, the article sold, the quantity, the purpose stated, the name and address of the buyer, and the buyer's signature. He put his finger on the line for the 18th of January. He read out, in a clerk's careful voice, the entry there, that on that date, at 11 in the morning, he had sold to Walter Horsford of Fen End Farm, near Kimbolton, 1 drachm of strychnine, for the destruction of rats in a granary, and that Horsford had signed for it in his own hand. He then held the poison register alongside the sealed letter that Rowley had brought from Stowe, and he told the jury that in his opinion, formed on the sight of the two together, the two signatures were in one and the same hand. He passed both to the foreman of the jury, who passed them along the bench. There was a pause after the chemist stood down. Wade at the master's desk was writing. Ives was watching the jury, and then Annie's mother was called. She came up from the bench at the back of the room, in her Sunday dress and her Sunday bonnet, and she stood in the small space cleared for the witnesses at the side of the desk, and she took the oath in a level voice. She was asked, and she answered, the plain questions the coroner's court had to ask her. She named her daughter, she named her daughter's age, she told the court that her daughter had been in a condition, at the end of January, that she had not thought fit to speak of at market, and that she had known of that condition, and that her daughter had told her the name of the man responsible, and that a correspondence had passed. She was asked whether she could identify the letter that had been produced. She looked at it. She said, in the voice she had used across the parlour table at Stowe on the Wednesday afternoon in December, that she could, and that it was in the hand of her sister's boy Walter, and that she had known his hand since he was a child, in a schoolroom not unlike the one she was standing in. I do not think I need to walk you through the rest of the day at a witness-by-witness pace. The elder brother spoke, the younger sister spoke, briefly, and cried at the end of it, and was allowed to sit down before the coroner had quite finished. The constable spoke, the doctor spoke again, in answer to a question from a juror about whether any other cause of death could reasonably be posed. He said, in a plain sentence, that in his opinion no other cause could be. The coroner summed up at close to 4 in the afternoon, in the light already going in the schoolroom, with a lamp brought forward onto the master's desk for the last of the writing. He told the jury that they had to consider 2 things, whether Annie Holmes had died of poisoning by strychnine, and, if so, whether a person known to them had willfully caused that poisoning. The jury withdrew for less than half an hour. They came back into the schoolroom in the same order they had gone out, and the foreman, who was a churchwarden of the parish of Spaldwick and a farmer of some standing, gave, in a plain country voice, their verdict. Annie Holmes, of Stowe Longer, aged 29 years, had died on the 1st day of February, in the year 1898, of poisoning by strychnine, wilfully administered to her by her cousin, Walter Horsford, of Fen End Farm, near Kimbolton, in the same county. Come out onto the green with me for a moment before we close the day. The lamp in the schoolroom window went out at close to 7. The village was quiet. A few of the jurors stood in a group at the porch of the public house across the road, in coats and mufflers, without going in. The coroner and his officer were driven back to Huntingdon in Wade's own carriage, with the sealed letter and the sealed packet and the cup on the folded cloth in a wooden box under the seat. Rowley was already gone. He had left the schoolroom by the side door as soon as the verdict was read, and he had ridden out along the Kimbolton road with a warrant in the inside pocket of his tunic, in the direction of Fen End Farm. What Walter Horsford was doing when the constable came up the lane to his own gate is a piece of the record I will save for the room where the door was opened. It is enough, for this hour, to say that the parish at Stowe had already, by the time the schoolroom lamp was put out, stopped whispering and started speaking plainly, and that in the flat wet country between Kimbolton and Huntingdon, from the following morning onward, there was only one name on the lips of any man at any market, and it was the name that had been read aloud by the foreman on the master's desk under the window at Spaldwick, as the light in the schoolroom had begun, at last, to fail. The Assizes at Huntingdon. Come with me now, from the wet lane at Stowe Longer to the market square at Huntingdon, and let a season pass between the one place and the other. That is the way of a country prosecution in the year 1898. The magistrates at Kimbolton committed Walter Horsford in the first week of February. The county paper carried the shape of the case in a plain column on the Saturday following. And then, for 4 full months, the whole matter went into the quiet keeping of the clerk of assize at Huntingdon, and the flat country outside settled down to a spring of ploughing and lambing and Easter chapel, while Walter himself sat, on remand, in the county gaol at the far end of the town he had once walked into, on market days, with a purse of butter money in his pocket. The assizes came, as they came every year, in the middle weeks of June. The judge who rode into Huntingdon on the summer circuit that year was a man of nearly 70, thin, grey, precise in speech, and known on every circuit in England as a judge who did not waste an hour. He took his lodgings, as the judge of Assizes always took them, in a house on the market square lent to the Crown for the week. He was met at the station by the High Sheriff of the county in a carriage with an escort, and he was accompanied, on the Monday morning, in the same carriage and behind the same escort, the short distance from the sheriff's house to the door of the Shire Hall. The Shire Hall at Huntingdon that year stood on the marketplace, a plain building of grey stone, with the county arms above the door and a bell in the roof that was rung at the opening of the court. Inside, the Assize Court itself was a room of dark panelling and high windows, with a raised bench at one end for the judge, a table below it for the clerks, a rail for the barristers in wigs and gowns, a box on one side for the witnesses, and a dock on the other for the prisoner. The public gallery ran along the back, and by the time the constable at the door had opened it for the morning of Walter's trial, every bench in it was full, and men were standing 4 deep behind the last row. Let me pause here for one thing before we go into the room. I have found no full transcript of the Horsford trial in any archive I have been able to reach. What I have is the summing up of the judge as it was reported in the county paper the week after, the daily accounts of the same paper across the 3 days of the trial, a longer piece in a London paper of the Sunday, and the notes of the chemist Reddell from Kimbolton, which passed at some later date into the county record office. From those 4 sources it is possible to say who spoke, in what order, and what the substance was. The exact words of every question and every answer are not always given, and I will hold to the substance where the wording is not sure. The prisoner was brought up from the cells below the Shire Hall a little before 10. He came up a narrow stair into the dock in his own coat and his own collar and his own boots, without irons. The gaoler at his elbow was a man he had come to know across 4 months in the remand ward, and by the account of one who watched from the gallery, the two of them exchanged a plain word at the head of the stair before Walter stepped forward into the light. He was 32 years old that summer. He had lost, by the same account, some flesh across the 4 months on Gaol food, and the beard he had worn at the farm was gone. He looked, the paper said, like a working man in his own Sunday clothes, and he took the rail of the dock in both hands, and he stood. The indictment was read. He was asked how he pleaded. He answered, in a level voice the gallery could hear at the back, not guilty. He was told he might sit. He remained standing. The clerk took his seat. The judge nodded to the counsel for the Crown, and the case was opened. The counsel for the Crown that day was a Queen's counsel from the Norfolk circuit, a heavy-set man with a slow delivery who wasted no ornament on the opening. He set out, in perhaps 20 minutes, the plain shape of the case as the coroner's jury at Spaldwick had already found it in February. He told the assize jury that they would hear, from Annie's mother, of the state of her daughter in the last weeks of January. They would hear, from the chemist Reddell of Kimbolton, of a sale of 1 drachm of strychnine to the prisoner in that town on the 18th of that month, entered in the poison register in the prisoner's own hand for the stated purpose of destroying rats in a granary. They would hear, from Dr. Talbot, of the state of the young woman when he reached the farmhouse in the small hours of the 1st of February, and of his settled opinion as to the cause of death. They would see, and hear read aloud, the letter that had been found on the painted table at the head of Annie Holmes's bed, and they would be invited, on the evidence of the 2 signatures side by side, to conclude that the same hand had signed the register at the chemist's shop and had written the letter at the farmhouse. And they would hear, at the last, from a chemist of Cambridge who had made up, in his own laboratory and under instructions from the Crown, a packet in the exact quantity that had been sold to the prisoner in January, and who would tell them what a drachm of strychnine given in half a cup of water would do to a healthy young woman of 29, and how long it would take to do it. The witnesses came, that first day, in the order the counsel had promised. Come with me only through those parts of it that a listener half asleep can hold in one ear, because the record for the day is long, and the wet stone of the Shire Hall does not need to be walked through inch by inch to be understood. Dr. Talbot repeated, in the box, what he had said at Spaldwick in February, the ride from Kimbolton in the rain, the hour of his arrival, the sight of the room, the position of the body, the sealed packet on the painted table, the letter beside it, the cup on the washstand. Constable Rowley repeated, in his uniform tunic, what he had said at Spaldwick. The entry into the yard on the morning of the 1st of February, the walk up the back stairs, the numbering of the envelopes at the painted table, the carrying of the cup down into the parlour on a folded cloth. Robert Ives, the coroner's officer, produced the wooden box in which he had carried all 3 items to Huntingdon on the Friday of that same week, and the seals of red wax on the 2 envelopes were shown, unbroken, to the jury by the clerk of the court. And then, in the middle of the afternoon of that first day, the chemist Reddell was called. He came into the box in the same dark suit he had worn in the schoolroom at Spaldwick in February, with the same poison register under his arm, and he laid the register on the ledge of the box, and he opened it at the leaf that had been marked with a slip of paper for the 18th of January. He read out, in the careful voice of a man who had read out that entry in 3 rooms already, and would read it out in 1 more before the week was over, the ruled columns, the date, the article sold, the quantity, the purpose stated, the name of the buyer, the address of the buyer, and the signature of the buyer in the last column of all. He was asked by the counsel for the Crown whether the signature in the register was in the hand of the prisoner in the dock. He said, without any hesitation the reporter for the county paper could hear, that it was. He was asked whether he could speak to the writing on the letter that had been found beside Annie Holmes's bed. He said he could not speak to the writing on it as a matter of expertise, because he was not a writing master, but that on the plain sight of the 2 together, he was as sure as he had been of anything in his life that the same hand had written both. The letter was then read into the record. I do not want to give the whole of it here, because the whole of it belongs to Annie Holmes, and to the drawer of her painted table, and not to a public room, and because the parts of it that matter for the case were only these, that the writer had told the reader to take the powder in half a cup of water, and to swallow the water at once, and to tell no one, and to trust him, and to burn the letter when she had done. Annie Holmes had done 3 of the 4. She had not burned the letter. That failure, at the last, was what put the writer of it into the dock at Huntingdon that summer afternoon. The counsel for the Crown asked, in the box, whether there was any doubt in the mind of the witness on the matter of the 2 signatures. The chemist said there was none. He was cross-examined at some length by the counsel for the defence, who was a young barrister of the Midland Circuit, newly instructed in the case, and doing what could be done with the material he had. The chemist did not shift. He was allowed to stand down. The register itself, with the leaf for the 18th of January turned back and pinned open, was passed along the front bench of the jury by the foreman, and each of the 12, in turn, held it under the light from the high window and looked at the signature in the last column and set it down again in silence. Come with me out of the room for the length of the evening, because the court rose at close to 6. The judge went back to the sheriff's house on the market square in the same carriage and behind the same escort. The jury were kept, as an assize jury in a capital case was always kept, in a room upstairs in the Shire Hall, with a constable at the door, and their supper was sent in from the inn across the market. The prisoner was taken back down the narrow stair to the cells. And in the country round about, at every farmhouse for 10 miles, the shape of the day was already being told over a supper table, because the county paper on the Saturday would carry it in full, and the men who had stood 4 deep at the back of the gallery had gone home along the lanes at dusk, with the evidence still fresh in their heads. The second day was given to the chemist from Cambridge, and to Annie's mother, and to the elder brother, and to the younger sister of 15 who had crossed the landing in the night, and to the counsel for the defence, who had, in truth, very little to lay before the court that he had not tried to lay before it already in the cross-examination of the day before. The Cambridge chemist held up, for the jury, a folded paper of the same size and the same shape as the one on the painted table, and he told them, in the plain voice of a man of his profession, what a drachm of strychnine given in half a cup of water would do to a young woman of 29, and how long the whole of it would take from the swallowing to the last breath, and why the fits would come in the order they had come, and why, in the intervals between them, the sufferer could speak, and did. He was, by the account of the paper, a very quiet witness, and the room was silent for the whole of his evidence, and the foreman of the jury, at the end of it, thanked him from the bench in a voice not much above a whisper. Annie's mother was the last of the witnesses of fact. She came into the box in the same Sunday dress she had worn at Spaldwick in February, and she took the oath, and she answered the same plain questions she had answered there, and one more. She was asked, by the counsel for the Crown, at the close of her evidence, whether she wished to say anything further to the court on her own account. She said, in a level voice the reporter for the London paper preserved word for word, that she wished only to say that her daughter had been a good young woman and had been ill-used, and that the man who had ill-used her was in the room, and that she had nothing else to say. She was thanked, she stood down, she went to her seat on the bench at the side of the court, and she did not raise her eyes again for the whole of the afternoon. The judge summed up on the morning of the third day. He began at 10, and he ended a little before 1. He went, in careful order, through the evidence of the chemist Reddell and the poison register, through the evidence of the constable Rowley and the sealed envelopes, through the evidence of Dr. Talbot and the state of the room Stow Longer in the middle of the night of the 1st of February, through the evidence of the chemist from Cambridge, and, at the last, through the letter itself, of which the substance had by then been in the record for 2 full days. He reminded the jury that they were not asked to consider the private life of the prisoner or the private life of the young woman. They were asked to consider whether the powder that had killed Annie Holmes had been sent to her by the man in the dock, and, if so, whether he had sent it knowing what it would do. He told them, at the end, that if they were sure of both, they had only one verdict to return, and that if they were not sure of either, they had another. He sent them out at 1:15. They were out for less than an hour. Come with me back into the room for the last of that day. The court reassembled at close to 2. The prisoner was brought up again from the cells below, and stood again at the rail of the dock. The jury filed back into their box in the same order they had left it. The clerk asked the foreman whether they were agreed on their verdict. The foreman, who was a farmer of the parish of Godmanchester and a churchwarden of some standing, said in a plain country voice that they were. He was asked whether they found the prisoner guilty or not guilty of the murder of Annie Holmes. He said, without any pause the gallery could hear, guilty. He was asked whether that was the verdict of them all. He said it was. The judge did what the judge of Assizes in a capital case in the year 1898 had to do. He put on the black cap. He spoke the plain words of the sentence, without any addition of his own to soften them or to sharpen them, in the level voice he had used for the whole 3 days. He committed the prisoner to the custody of the sheriff, to be taken to a place of lawful execution, and there to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. He directed that the body be buried within the walls of the prison in which the sentence should be carried out. He said, at the very end, in a shorter voice, that he hoped the prisoner would make use of the time that remained to him. He did not look at the dock again. Walter Horsford stood through the sentence with both his hands on the rail. When the judge had finished, he was turned by the gaoler at his elbow, and he was taken down the same narrow stair he had come up on the Monday morning. The gaoler that night, and the officer of the Crown who signed the removal warrant at close to 7 in the evening, delivered him not back to the county gaol at Huntingdon, but into the escort that would carry him, along the flat country and through the wet June dusk, to the condemned cell at Cambridge, where the bell above the yard and the hangman who would in due course ring it were already waiting. The cell at Cambridge Gaol. Come with me now, out of the Shire Hall at Huntingdon, and into the closed carriage that stood at the yard door that evening. It is easier to sit beside a condemned man on a road he cannot see out of, than to try to picture him already in the cell he has been sent to. The wet June dusk was down over the flat country by the time the carriage rolled out onto the eastern road. 2 officers of the Crown rode inside with him. A constable of the county force rode on the box beside the driver. The road from Huntingdon to Cambridge in that year ran, for most of its length, between hedges cut back for the summer, past chapels and gates and the plain brick fronts of farmhouses lit here and there by the last lamp of the day. Walter Horsford did not, by any account, speak on the drive. He sat, with his hands on his knees, in the middle of the leather seat, and he looked at the door of the carriage, and he waited. They came into Cambridge from the west a little before 10. The Gaol at Cambridge in the year 1898 stood on Castle Hill, a mile above the river, a rectangle of grey brick and iron behind a wall of the same brick, 15 feet high, with a gatehouse in the middle of the wall and a bell in the tower above the gatehouse. The bell was not rung for the arrival of a prisoner in the ordinary way of the day. It was rung once for the death of a prisoner, and once again on the morning of an execution, and the town of Cambridge that lay below the hill knew both of those tolls without needing to be told what they were. The condemned cell at Cambridge Gaol lay on the ground floor of the wing nearest the yard, where the scaffold was set up on the mornings of hangings. It was a room of about 12 feet by 9, with walls of whitewashed brick, a single high window barred on the inside, an iron bedstead against one wall, a deal table under the window with 2 plain chairs, and a gas jet in a wire cage above the table that burned through the whole of the night. There was no door onto the passage in the ordinary sense of a door. In its place hung an iron gate of close bars on hinges of the same iron, and a wooden door was hung outside the gate that was closed at night and opened at first light. Beyond the gate, in the passage, 3 warders sat in rotation on a bench against the opposite wall, with a copy of the daily orders on the bench between them, and at no hour of the day or of the night, from the moment Walter Horsford was locked into that room until the moment he was walked out of it, were fewer than 2 of them in view of him at once. That was the rule of the condemned cell in England in that year, and it was kept. Let me stay in the room for a moment before I bring in the men who came in and out of it, because the shape of the days of a condemned man at Cambridge in 1898 is not always known now, and it matters here. The jail day began at 6 in the morning. A warder brought a jug of water and a basin, and a razor with a guarded edge, and Walter shaved himself in the presence of the warder, and washed his face and his neck, and dressed in the clothes he had worn at trial, which had been brushed for him overnight. Breakfast was brought at 7. It was tea from a tin pot, a piece of bread, and, on some days, a rasher of bacon from the Gaol kitchen. The chaplain came at 8. Exercise was allowed for half an hour in a small walled yard off the passage at 9, in the presence of 2 warders and no other prisoner. Dinner was at noon. The chaplain returned in the middle of the afternoon. Supper was at 6. The gas jet burned all night above the deal table, and one of the warders read the newspaper at the passage bench, in a voice low enough not to carry into the cell, but audible if a man on the iron bedstead lay awake, as a low murmur at the door. The chaplain of Cambridge Gaol that summer was a clergyman of the Church of England of about 50 years of age, whose name is preserved in the prison return for the year, but which I will keep out of the telling here, because he has no relation living now who need see it, and because what passed between him and Walter Horsford in that room across those 4 weeks was of a private kind that even the record does not attempt to give in full. The chaplain came in at 8 on the first morning. The warder let him through the gate with the key. He sat down at the deal table on one of the 2 chairs. Between them on the wood he set a leather-bound Bible with a marker in it and a small notebook of his own, and he waited for the prisoner to come to the other chair. Walter came to the chair. He sat down. On that first morning he did not say very much at all. The chaplain read from the book he had brought. One plain question he asked at the end. He closed the book. He stood up. He said he would come again in the afternoon, and he did. There is very little in the printed record about what was said in those first 2 or 3 days between the chaplain and the man in the cell. The chaplain's own notebook for that summer is not in the county record office, and was not, so far as I have been able to find, kept by his family. What is on the printed record is the shape of the visits, twice a day for the first week, 3 times a day from the second week onward, and, in the 3rd week, the first letter that Walter Horsford wrote in his own hand from the deal table under the barred window. Come with me to the table for that letter, because it is the piece of the record I most want you to hear before the room fills up again with the other things that had to be done in it. The letter was to his wife. It was written on a single sheet of blue prison paper, ruled, watermarked with the arms of the Home Office, at some point in the middle of the 3rd week of June. It was seen and read, before it was folded and sealed and sent out through the governor, by the chaplain, and by the deputy governor, and by the governor himself, in the manner that every letter written from a condemned cell in England in that year was seen and read before it was allowed to go. The full text of it has not, so far as I have been able to find, ever been printed. What was printed in one line in the county paper of the Saturday following his death is that the writer had asked his wife to keep the farm as long as she could, and to keep the child as well as she could, and to think of him not by the last thing he had done, but by the first years of the marriage before he had gone wrong. That is the substance the papers were allowed to give, and I will not go beyond it. The rest belongs to her. His wife did not come to Cambridge. She wrote back once. Her letter came into the cell in the ordinary post, and was read to him at the deal table by the chaplain on the afternoon of the day it arrived. What she said in it is not on the record at all. I have looked. From the day the constable had ridden up to her gate at the beginning of February until the morning the bell was rung above the yard at the top of Castle Hill, she did not, so far as any paper or any prison return shows, ever leave Fen End Farm. The confession came in the 4th week of June. It did not come all at once. Across 3 afternoons at the deal table, by the account of the chaplain later given, it came in answer to 3 plain questions the chaplain had put to him with the Bible open on the table between them. Walter Horsford admitted, in the first of those sittings, that he had bought the strychnine at the chemist's shop in Kimbolton on the 18th of January in the year that was then running, and that he had bought it, in truth, not for the destruction of rats in the granary at Fen End Farm, but for the sending of the packet that had been found on the painted table at the head of Annie Holmes's bed. In the second, he admitted that he had written the letter that had gone with the packet, and had written it in the settled expectation of the effect that had followed. On the 3rd afternoon he admitted that he had done both of these things knowing that they would kill her, and that he had done them because he had not been able to see any other way out of the arrangement that had grown up between them across the years since the courtship at the Stiles. A written statement of these 3 things he signed on the last afternoon of the 3rd sitting, in the presence of the chaplain and of the deputy governor of the Gaol, and the statement was placed, sealed, in the file of his case at the office of the governor, from which it passed in due course into the file at the county record office, in which it can still be read. The chaplain, at the end of that 3rd afternoon, closed the Bible on the deal table, and he asked the prisoner one more question, which is the one question the record does preserve, because the chaplain wrote it down that night in his own hand, in a note that has survived. He asked whether Walter Horsford was, at that hour, sorry. Walter Horsford answered that he was. By the chaplain's note he said further that he had been sorry from the morning the constable had ridden up to the gate at Fen End Farm, and had been sorry, in a lesser way, from the hour the letter and the packet had left his own hand at the box in Kimbolton, and had been most sorry of all in the 4 weeks he had sat under the gas jet in this cell, and would be sorry on the last morning, and would be sorry when he went down the yard, and would be sorry as long as he had breath, and would be sorry, if it were allowed of him, after that. The chaplain closed his notebook. He stood up. Across the deal table he put out his hand. Walter Horsford took it, and held it for a moment, and let it go. Come out with me now, into the passage beyond the iron gate, for the length of a breath, because the last week of that cell has to be told a little at a distance. The letters to his wife had gone. The one letter from her had been read to him. His confession had been signed. What was left, in the room of whitewashed brick, was the ordinary keeping of a man from 1 hour to the next, until an hour that had already been fixed. The date of the execution had been set, by the sheriff of the county in consultation with the governor, for the last Tuesday of June, at 8 o'clock in the morning. In the same warrant, in the plain hand of the clerk of the peace, the hangman had been named as James Billington, of Farnworth, in the county of Lancaster, engaged upon the ordinary scale of fees. The nights in the 4th week were the longest of the cell. The gas jet burned as it had burned across the whole of the 4 weeks. The warders on the passage bench turned the pages of the paper. On some nights the prisoner on the iron bedstead lay with his face to the wall, and on other nights with his face to the gate, and, on the very last of the nights, by the account of the warder who kept the middle watch, he did not lie down at all, but sat, from about 2 in the morning until the first grey came into the barred window above the deal table, on the edge of the bedstead, with his hands folded across his knees, and looked at the door. The bell above the yard at the top of Castle Hill was not rung on that night. Twice, in the ordinary way of the day, it would be rung on the morning that was coming, once at the striking of the hour, and once again a little while after, when the drop had fallen and the ordinary work of the Gaol was done. James Billington had come into Cambridge, in the plain manner of a man of his profession, on the evening train from the north, and had taken his lodging at the inn used by the Crown for such nights, and had walked, at close to midnight, up Castle Hill in the wet dark to look, without going in, at the gate under the tower. The rope he would use in the morning was already, by the rule of the office, in the keeping of the governor of the Gaol, in a locked cupboard in a room 3 doors down the passage from the cell of Walter Horsford, and had been measured against the height and the weight of the man to be dropped, and had been given the pull it needed to give. And in the cell itself, under the gas jet, the man sat on the edge of the bedstead, and he waited for the first grey at the window, and the wet fields of Spaldwick, 3 counties away across the flat country, waited for the hour that would in due course be spoken across them by the bell above the yard. Come with me up Castle Hill one last time, in the grey hour before the sun. It is the last Tuesday of June, in the year 1898, and the rain that had held over Cambridgeshire through the whole of the night has thinned, an hour before dawn, to a fine drift that hangs in the air above the town, without falling in any weight upon the pavement. The road up the hill from the river was empty at 5 in the morning. It did not stay empty for very long. By 6, a scattering of townspeople had begun to gather, in 2s and 3s, along the low wall opposite the gatehouse of the Gaol, and by 7:30, the number along that wall was in the low hundreds, and the constables of the borough, force in their capes, were walking the line to keep the roadway clear for the traffic that had, on any other Tuesday of the year, the right to use it. Inside the walls of the Gaol, at that hour, the ordinary work of the morning was going forward, as it went forward on any other day. The gates of the wings were unlocked at 6. The kitchen fires were lit at 1:15. The bell over the passage inside was rung at 1:30 for the rising of the ordinary prisoners on the wings above, who took their breakfast in their cells and did not, on that morning, come down for the yard. That was the rule of an execution day at Cambridge in that year. The wings did not walk. The workshops did not open. The gaol, for the hour on either side of 8, was held in a plain silence, so that the ordinary men and women of the place could be about their own quiet business in their cells, while the other business of the morning was carried out in the yard below. In the room of whitewashed brick on the ground floor, the gas jet above the deal table had been turned down at a little after 4 by a warder coming on for the last of the night watches, so that the first grey at the barred window could reach into the cell without the yellow of the flame across it. Walter Horsford had not slept. The warder on the middle watch, in his statement afterwards to the governor, said that from about 2 in the morning until the turning down of the gas, the prisoner had sat on the edge of the iron bedstead with his hands folded, and had not spoken, and had not asked for water, and had not moved except once, to draw the grey blanket from the bed up over his shoulders, against the chill that came in under the barred window with the last of the rain. At 6, the outer wooden door of the cell was opened. The warder brought in a basin and a jug, and the guarded razor, and Walter shaved himself as he had shaved himself on every morning of the 4 weeks, in the presence of the warder, and washed his face and his neck and his hands. He put on the same clothes he had worn at the Assizes at Huntingdon, which had been brushed for him overnight. The collar was set by his own hand at the throat. He sat down again on the edge of the bedstead, and the warder took the basin and the jug and the razor out through the iron gate, and locked the gate behind him. Breakfast was brought in at close to 6:15. It was the ordinary breakfast of a condemned man in an English gaol in that year. Tea in a tin pot, a piece of bread, and a small piece of bacon on a plate of grey ware. He ate a little of the bread. He drank a cup of the tea. He did not touch the bacon. The plate was taken out again by the warder, without any word between them. The chaplain came in at 7:30. He came in without the leather-bound Bible he had carried on the earlier mornings, because on this morning the reading would be done in the passage at the last, and in the yard, and he did not need the book in the room. He sat down at the deal table on the chair he had always sat in. Walter came to the other chair. Between them on the wood the chaplain laid his own hand, palm down, and Walter Horsford put his own hand on top of it, and they sat like that, in a silence the warder on the passage bench afterwards said was not, to his ear, the silence of 2 men who had run out of things to say, but the silence of two men who had already said them. Let me stay outside for a moment before the last part of it, because the yard itself has a shape you should know before we walk into it. The scaffold at Cambridge Gaol in that year stood in the smaller of the 2 yards inside the gatehouse, on the eastern side of the wing that held the condemned cell, against a wall of the same grey brick as the rest of the building. It was a low platform of dark wood, 6 paces by 4, with a rail on 3 sides at the height of the waist. A wooden beam ran across the top of the platform at the height of a tall man's reach, supported at either end by an upright post set into the platform itself. From the middle of the beam, on the morning of an execution, the rope was hung. Below the platform, in the middle of it, was a trap, worked by a lever at the side, which the hangman drew when the drop was to be given. The whole of the structure had been put up on the afternoon of the day before by 2 carpenters of the Gaol, and had been tested in the manner the office required. A bag of sand of the weight of the prisoner had been dropped through the trap on the evening, and the rope had been left overnight on the beam under the weight, and had been taken off at first light and given the pull that James Billington himself had asked for. The hangman was in the yard by 7:45. He came out from the small room that had been given him for the night, on the ground floor near the gate, in his own black coat and his own black hat, and he walked once round the platform and looked up at the rope on the beam and adjusted, with both hands, the leather strap of the pinioning that would be put on Walter Horsford's arms in the passage in a few minutes' time. James Billington that summer was a man of about 50 years of age, from the town of Farmhouse in the county of Lancaster, a barber and a publican by trade in his ordinary life, and a hangman by appointment of the sheriffs of the counties of England for the length of a decade by then, of a manner that was said, by the officers who worked with him, to be quiet and unshowy, and careful of the men he was to hang, and of the ordinary courtesy that the office required in every part of it. He looked, at 7:50, at the small clock that had been carried out to the yard for the purpose, and set the pinion down on the rail of the platform, and stood back and waited. The bell above the gatehouse was rung at 8. It was not a loud bell. The men and women along the low wall opposite the gate heard it clearly enough for their heads to turn to the sound, and the ones who had come with hats in their hands put the hats on again, and the ones who had come with hats on took the hats off. A silence went along the line that was not asked for by any constable, and did not need to be. Inside the walls, in the passage outside the cell, the iron gate was drawn back for the last time. The chaplain walked out of the room first, in his black gown, with the book he had gone back for held open in both hands at the place he was going to read from. Walter Horsford walked out after him, between the 2 warders who had come to the door of the cell to fetch him, without any word from either of them. The hangman was waiting at the turn of the passage. He came forward. He put the leather strap round the arms of the prisoner at the elbows, and drew it and buckled it at the back, with a plain courtesy of movement that the warder in his statement afterwards said had been done in less time than it takes to tell it. He stepped back. He said, in a voice not above a low tone, "Come on, sir." He said it in the plain way a man says such a thing to another man he is about to help across a difficult place, and not in any other way at all. They walked, 4 of them and the chaplain, in a short procession, along the passage, and out through the small door at the end of it, and into the yard. The rain had lifted. In the 10 minutes since the bell, a grey light lay over the grey brick, and a single starling on the wall of the Gaol opposite lifted from its place at the tread of the party in the yard, and flew away in a low line over the roofs of Castle Hill towards the river. The chaplain read, in the voice he had used at the deal table for the 4 weeks, from the psalm he had chosen the night before. Walter Horsford walked with him. He walked, by the account of the 2 warders afterwards, without any stagger and without any pause, in the length of the yard between the door and the foot of the platform, and he set his own boot on the step at the front of the platform, and he went up the 3 steps in the ordinary way a working man goes up any 3 steps of dark wood in the ordinary morning of a working day. On the platform he stood on the trap where the hangman placed him. The strap at his ankles was set by the hangman kneeling for a moment on the boards. The white cap was taken from the rail. The chaplain, at the end of the psalm, closed the book and stepped back from the platform to the wall of the yard. The hangman set the cap over the head of the prisoner and drew it down. He put the rope round the neck. He set the knot at the angle the office required. He stepped back to the lever at the side of the platform. He looked, once, at the deputy governor at the wall. The deputy governor gave the plain nod that was to be given. The lever was drawn, the trap opened, the rope took the weight and held. The bell above the gatehouse was rung once again, at close to 5 past the hour, in the plain notice to the town below that the ordinary work of the morning was done. Along the low wall opposite, the men who had come with their hats off put them on. The men who had come with their hats on took them off, for a moment, and put them on again. The line broke up, slowly, in ones and twos, along the road down the hill. Inside, in the yard, the doctor of the Gaol came out from the room in which he had been waiting, and stood at the foot of the platform, and gave the plain time. The body was cut down at a little after 9, in the presence of the deputy governor, and of a jury of 12 townsmen who had been sworn in the night before, for the ordinary inquest that the law required upon every man hanged in an English prison in that year. The verdict was returned in the plain form the law required, that the deceased had died by the sentence of the court, lawfully carried out. The burial was made, that afternoon, in the ordinary manner of the day, within the walls of the Gaol, in an unmarked place inside the north yard, in quicklime, in the presence of the chaplain and of 2 warders, and of no other person at all. Come with me, one last time, out of the walls of the Gaol, and back over the flat country to the west. It is easier, at the end of a story like this one, to stand for a moment where it began, than to stand where it ended. By 9:30 that morning, the news of the drop had reached the market at Huntingdon, 30 miles away, in the plain way news of such a morning travelled in that year, by the telegraph to the postmaster, and from the postmaster along the counter, and out along the lanes with the men going home from their errands. It reached Fen End Farm at close to 11. The wife of Walter Horsford had asked, in the middle of the last week, not to be told the hour, and not to be told the day, and to be left to hear it, whenever it came, in the ordinary way of the parish. It was brought to her at the door of the farmhouse by the wife of the neighbour who had ploughed for her the field between the road and the withy bed in the winter that was past. The 2 women stood at the door. The neighbour told her in one sentence what had been done at Cambridge at 8. The wife of Walter Horsford said, in a voice the neighbour afterwards said was steady, "Thank you." She closed the door. She did not come out again that day. At Stow Longer, at the same hour, the mother of Annie Holmes was in the kitchen of the farmhouse, at the table under the window, where the wet lane could be seen. The news came to her from her elder son, who had ridden into Kimbolton in the morning, and had heard it there. She was, by the account he gave later to the chapel minister, at the kitchen table with a bowl of peas in her lap, in the middle of shelling them. She set the bowl on the table. She sat, for a long time, with her hands quiet on the wood in front of her. She did not weep. She did not speak. She sat, until the light in the wet lane outside had begun to shift with the middle of the day, and then she stood, and went to the shelf on the wall behind the range, and took down the small photograph of her daughter in the paper frame that had stood there since the year of her leaving school, and she carried it, without any hurry, out of the kitchen and up the back stairs, and set it in the drawer of the painted table at the head of the bed in the room upstairs, and closed the drawer. She came down again. She sat down at the table under the window. She picked up the bowl of peas. She went on shelling them, one at a time, into the palm of her hand. The rain came back over the flat country in the middle of the afternoon. It moved slow across the fields between Kimbolton and Stow Longer, and across the fields between Stow Longer and Spaldwick, and out over the lane, and over the pantile roof of the farmhouse at Fen End, and over the roof of the harness room, where the small brown packets had once stood on the shelf against the rats, and over the low stone of the church at Spaldwick, where a cousin and a cousin had once stood on the same tiles in the same Sunday light, without knowing anything at all of what the years ahead would ask of them. The bell above the yard at Cambridge did not ring again that day. The town below the hill went about the ordinary evening of a June Tuesday, and out over the wet country to the west, the light went down as it had gone down on every other evening of that summer, without any change in it, over the fields that had been walked and ploughed and harvested and buried in for 1,000 years before this story was written, and would be walked and ploughed and harvested and buried in for as long, again, after it was done. The candle beside me has burned low. The room is quiet now, and history, in the plain way of it, turns the page in the dark, and closes the book, and sets it down, and leaves the wet fields of Spaldwick to their long, level rest under the rain.